Hello there, welcome to Long History American Channel. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most dramatic naval confrontations in history, the Spanish Armada of 1588. This is a story about the mightiest naval force ever assembled. 130 ships carrying nearly 30,000 men, sent by the most powerful empire on earth to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. It's a story about religious warfare between Catholic Spain and Protestant England, about brilliant naval tactics against overwhelming odds, about storms that destroyed a fleet, and about how this single event changed the course of history, not just for Europe, but for America. Because here's the thing, the Spanish Armada is directly connected to American history. Remember John White from the Lost Colony? He couldn't return to Roanoke because England needed every ship to fight the Armada. The colonists disappeared while England was fighting for survival. So settle in. We're heading to the summer of 1588, when the fate of nations hung in the balance, and the English Channel became a battlefield that would determine the future of the world. To understand why Spain sent the largest naval force in history to invade England in 1588, we need to understand the decades of tension, hatred, and conflict that led to this moment. At the heart of everything was religion. This was the era of religious warfare in Europe. Catholics versus Protestants, with both sides convinced the other was heretical, dangerous, and damned. Spain under King Philip II was the champion of Catholicism. Philip saw himself as God's instrument to defend the Catholic Church against Protestant heresy. He was devout, serious, and absolutely committed to crushing Protestantism wherever it appeared. England under Queen Elizabeth I was Protestant. Elizabeth had established the Church of England, a Protestant church that rejected papal authority. For Philip, this was intolerable heresy that needed to be corrected. But the conflict wasn't just religious, it was also political and economic. Spain in the 1580s was the superpower of the age. Spanish territories included Spain itself, the Netherlands, much of Italy, Portugal and its empire, and vast territories in the Americas, Mexico, Peru, the Caribbean, the Philippines. Spanish treasure fleets brought enormous wealth from American silver mines back to Spain. This wealth funded Spanish armies, Spanish fleets, and Spanish power throughout Europe. England was much smaller and poorer. But England was rising, developing naval power, exploring and colonizing, challenging Spanish dominance in ways that infuriated Philip. The tensions had been building for decades. Let's trace how we got to the brink of war. Philip II had actually been King of England briefly. In 1554, he married Mary I of England, Elizabeth's half-sister. Mary was Catholic, and her marriage to Philip was meant to bring England back to Catholicism and ally it with Spain. But Mary died in 1558 without children. Elizabeth became queen and immediately began moving England back toward Protestantism. Philip lost England, and he never stopped resenting it. Philip initially hoped to influence Elizabeth. Maybe she could be convinced to return England to Catholicism. Maybe she'd marry a Catholic prince. Maybe accommodation was possible. But Elizabeth had no intention of returning England to Catholicism or marrying Philip or any other Catholic ruler. She was committed to Protestant England and English independence from Spanish influence. As years passed and Elizabeth remained unmarried and Protestant, Philip's hopes faded and his frustration grew. The Netherlands added fuel to the fire. The Spanish Netherlands, modern Belgium and the Netherlands, had been part of Spanish territory. But in the 1560s, Dutch Protestants began rebelling against Spanish Catholic rule. This became the Dutch Revolt, a long, brutal conflict lasting decades. The Dutch wanted independence and religious freedom. Spain wanted to maintain control and crush Protestant heresy. England supported the Dutch rebels. Elizabeth sent money, weapons, and eventually troops to help the Dutch fight Spain. This was direct English interference in Spanish territories, an act of war in all but name. Philip was furious. Not only was England Protestant and refusing Spanish influence, but England was actively supporting rebellion in Spanish territories. Then there was the privateering. English privateers, essentially government-authorized pirates, attacked Spanish ships and colonies throughout the 1570s and 1580s. The most famous privateer was Sir Francis Drake. Drake raided Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and South America, captured Spanish treasure ships, and brought enormous wealth back to England. In 1577-1580, Drake circumnavigated the globe, raiding Spanish Pacific ports that had never been attacked before. He returned to England with a ship full of Spanish treasure. Elizabeth knighted him. Sir Francis Drake, celebrated English hero. From Philip's perspective, Drake was a pirate and heretic who deserved hanging. Elizabeth protecting and honouring him was an outrage. Drake's most audacious raid came in 1587. He attacked Cadiz, Spain itself, destroying ships and supplies Philip was assembling for a planned invasion of England. Drake called it singeing the King of Spain's beard, a humiliating attack on Spanish territory. The privateering cost Spain enormous amounts of money. More importantly, it was humiliating. The mighty Spanish Empire couldn't protect its own ships and colonies from English pirates. Religion, politics, and economics all pushed toward war. But the final trigger was personal and religious. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Elizabeth's Catholic cousin. Mary had been Queen of Scotland, but was forced to abdicate and fled to England in 1568. Elizabeth kept her imprisoned for 19 years. Mary became the focus of Catholic plots to overthrow Elizabeth. Catholic conspirators planned to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and make Mary Queen of England, returning England to Catholicism. Multiple plots were discovered and foiled through the 1570s and 1580s. Elizabeth's advisors pressured her to execute Mary as a traitor and threat. Elizabeth hesitated. Executing an anointed queen set a dangerous precedent. But in 1587, after another plot was discovered, Elizabeth finally agreed. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. Catholic Europe was outraged. Philip was furious, a Catholic queen murdered by a Protestant heretic queen. This was the final straw. Philip decided England had to be invaded, Elizabeth overthrown, and Catholicism restored. He would launch the largest naval invasion in history. He'd been planning an invasion for years, but Mary's execution made it urgent and gave it religious justification. This would be a holy war, God's punishment on heretical England. Pope Sixtus V supported the invasion, promising financial help and declaring it a crusade. Philip would be doing God's work, defending Catholicism and gaining England for Spain in one stroke. So in 1587-1588, Spain prepared the greatest naval armada ever assembled. Ships were gathered from throughout Spanish territories. Soldiers and sailors were recruited. Supplies were accumulated. Weapons were manufactured. Philip called it the enterprise of England, the invasion that would change everything. England watched Spanish preparations with growing alarm. Spies reported on the massive fleet being assembled. Elizabeth and her advisors knew an invasion was coming. England had much smaller military forces than Spain. If Spanish troops landed in England, the country might not be able to resist. England's survival depended on preventing Spanish troops from landing, which meant defeating the Armada at sea. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic naval confrontations. Catholic Spain versus Protestant England. The greatest naval power in the world versus a smaller but determined opponent. A clash that would determine the fate of nations and shape the future of the world. In 1587 and early 1588, Spain assembled the largest and most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. Let's understand the scale of what Philip II created and what the Armada was supposed to accomplish. The Spanish called it the Grande y Felicissima Armada, the Great and Most Fortunate Fleet. The English would call it the Invincible Armada, though that name was partly mocking after its defeat. The numbers were staggering, about 130 ships carrying approximately 30,000 men, including around 19,000 soldiers, 8,000 sailors, and 2,500 others, including officers, priests, and various support personnel. The fleet included different types of ships. The largest were galleons, massive warships with multiple decks of cannon. These were floating fortresses designed to overwhelm enemies with firepower and to transport large numbers of soldiers. Spain also included converted merchant ships, smaller warships, and support vessels carrying supplies, horses, siege equipment, and everything needed for a massive invasion. The fleet carried over 2,400 cannon, an enormous amount of firepower. It also carried tens of thousands of cannonballs, gunpowder, muskets, pikes, swords, and other weapons. The supplies were equally impressive. The Armada carried food for 6 months: salted meat, dried fish, cheese, beans, rice, wine, and water. Feeding 30,000 men for months required an enormous quantity of provisions. The fleet also carried everything needed to establish Spanish control once England was conquered: administrators, priests to restore Catholicism, and proclamations declaring Philip the new King of England. The commander of this great fleet was the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a Spanish nobleman with limited naval experience. This might seem like a strange choice, but Philip had reasons. The original commander, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, died early in 1588 while preparations were underway. Philip needed a replacement quickly and chose Medina Sidonia partly for his administrative abilities and partly for his high noble status. Medina Sidonia actually didn't want the job. He wrote to Philip saying he lacked naval experience, got seasick easily, and had no money to fund his part of the expedition. But Philip insisted. He needed someone he trusted absolutely, and Medina Sidonia was that person. The plan was complex and required coordination between multiple forces. Here's how it was supposed to work. The Armada would sail from Spain to the English Channel. Meanwhile, the Duke of Parma, commanding Spanish forces in the Netherlands, would prepare an army of about 30,000 soldiers. The Armada would meet Parma's army at Flanders, in what's now Belgium. The fleet would protect troop transports as Parma's army crossed the Channel to England. Once in England, the 30,000 Spanish soldiers from the Netherlands, combined with forces from the Armada, would march on London. Spanish military might would overwhelm English resistance. Elizabeth would be captured or killed. Catholic nobles in England who'd been oppressed under Protestant rule would rise up to support Spain. England would be conquered and return to Catholicism. That was the plan. It was ambitious, required perfect coordination, and depended on many things going right. The Armada left Lisbon, Portugal, in May 1588. Almost immediately, problems began. Storms scattered the fleet. Ships were damaged. Some had to return to port for repairs. The fleet had to regroup on the Spanish coast, delaying the invasion by several weeks. Supplies began spoiling in the heat. The salted meat and fish, stored in barrels, started rotting. Water barrels leaked. By the time the fleet was ready to sail again, food quality was already declining. The ships were overcrowded. 30,000 men packed onto ships designed for smaller crews meant cramped, unsanitary conditions. Disease began spreading: dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses that would kill hundreds before the fleet even reached England. But in late July 1588, the Armada finally entered the English Channel. The massive fleet, 130 ships stretching for miles, was spotted off the coast of Cornwall. Beacons were lit along the English coast, warning of the invasion. The message spread rapidly: the Armada has come. From English shores, people watched the Spanish fleet sail past. The sight must have been terrifying. Ship after ship after ship, more than anyone had ever seen in one place, carrying the army that would invade England. The Spanish ships sailed in a defensive formation, a crescent shape with the most powerful warships on the outside, protecting the transport vessels in the center. This formation was difficult to attack and allowed the fleet to protect itself while moving toward its destination. English ships began shadowing the Armada, following it up the channel, but not yet attacking in force. English commanders were assessing the Spanish fleet, looking for weaknesses, planning their strategy. The Armada sailed slowly up the channel, heading toward Calais, where they'd meet Parma's army. So far, the plan was working. The fleet had reached England. Now they needed to link up with Parma and begin the invasion. But the English weren't going to let that happen. English naval commanders, Lord Howard of Effingham as overall commander, with Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher as his key subordinates, were preparing to attack. The English fleet was smaller than the Spanish, maybe 200 ships total, but many were small vessels unsuitable for major combat. The core fighting fleet was perhaps 30 to 40 warships, less than a third the size of the Spanish Armada. But the English had advantages. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable than the heavy Spanish galleons. English guns had longer range and higher rates of fire. English sailors were experienced and their commanders were skilled. Most importantly, English were fighting for survival in their own waters. They knew these coasts. They understood channel weather and currents. They were desperate. If the Armada succeeded, England would be conquered and Protestantism crushed. The stage was set for battle. The greatest fleet ever assembled was sailing through the English Channel. A smaller but determined English fleet was preparing to stop them, and the fate of nations hung in the balance. As the Spanish Armada sailed up the English Channel in late July 1588, the English fleet began attacking. What followed was a week of running battles unlike anything naval warfare had seen before. Traditional naval combat in this era involved ships closing with each other, grappling together, and fighting essentially as floating platforms for soldiers to board enemy vessels. Naval battles were decided by soldiers fighting hand-to-hand on enemy ships. The Spanish expected this kind of fighting. They had superior numbers of soldiers. Their ships were built high to allow soldiers to fire down on enemy ships. Their strategy assumed they'd close with English ships, board them, and overwhelm them with superior numbers. But the English had a different approach. They'd fight at distance, with superior gunnery, staying out of range of Spanish attempts to grapple and board. The first major engagement came on July 31st off Plymouth. Drake led English ships in an attack on the rear of the Armada. The English sailed in quickly, fired broadsides. All guns on one side of the ship fired simultaneously, then retreated before Spanish ships could close and board. The Spanish tried to close the distance, to bring English ships into grappling range. But English ships were faster. They could keep distance while hammering Spanish ships with cannon fire. The Spanish formation, the defensive crescent, protected them from being overwhelmed. English couldn't break through to attack the vulnerable transport ships in the center. The Armada maintained cohesion and continued sailing toward their objective. But the English attacks were causing damage. Spanish ships were hit repeatedly, casualties mounted. Some ships were so damaged they fell behind, where English ships could isolate and capture them. 2 major Spanish ships were lost in the early fighting, the Rosario and the San Salvador. The Rosario had a collision that damaged its rigging, leaving it unable to keep up with the fleet. Drake captured it, along with its admiral and a substantial amount of gold the ship was carrying. The San Salvador's powder magazine exploded, possibly accident, possibly sabotage, killing about 200 men and leaving the ship a burning wreck. The crew abandoned ship and the English took it as a prize. These losses showed Spanish vulnerability. The supposedly invincible Armada had lost 2 major ships without the English fleet being seriously engaged, and the week of fighting had barely begun. Over the next several days, fighting continued as the Armada moved up the channel. The pattern repeated. English ships would attack, usually targeting stragglers or damaged ships, firing from distance, then retreating when Spanish ships tried to close. The Spanish were frustrated. They couldn't bring their superior numbers to bear. Their soldiers couldn't fight if English ships wouldn't come close enough to board. Their heavy guns couldn't hit maneuverable English ships. The English were also frustrated. Despite constant attacks, they weren't sinking many Spanish ships. The Spanish formation held. The Armada was damaged, but still moving toward its objective. Ammunition was becoming a problem for the English. They'd been firing constantly for days. Cannonballs and gunpowder were running low. If they couldn't stop the Armada soon, they'd run out of ammunition. By August 6, the Armada reached Calais on the French coast. This was the designated meeting point with Parma's army. Medina Sidonia anchored his fleet and sent urgent messages to Parma. "Bring the army, we're ready to invade." But there was a problem. Parma wasn't ready. His army was prepared, but the transport barges to carry them across the channel weren't assembled. He needed several days to gather barges and load his troops. More critically, Dutch rebel ships, Dutch sea beggars, were blockading the ports where Parma's forces were located. These Dutch ships were allied with England. They'd been waiting for this moment, and they weren't going to let Spanish troop barges leave port. Parma sent messages back. "I need more time, and I need the Armada to drive off the Dutch blockade before I can embark the army." Medina Sidonia was stuck. He couldn't leave to attack the Dutch because he'd been ordered to wait for Parma. But Parma couldn't come while the Dutch blockaded his ports. The Spanish plan was falling apart. Meanwhile, the English saw an opportunity. The Armada was anchored at Calais, packed close together for mutual protection. The ships were vulnerable. English commanders decided to use fire ships, a terrifying weapon that had been effective in previous naval battles. The idea was simple but devastating. Take old ships, fill them with anything flammable, set them on fire, and send them drifting toward the enemy fleet. Fire ships created panic. No captain wanted a burning ship drifting into his vessel, potentially setting it ablaze. The usual response was to cut anchor cables and flee, exactly what the English hoped the Spanish would do. On the night of August 7th, 8th, the English prepared 8 fire ships. These weren't just random ships. They were loaded with tar, pitch, and gunpowder to make them burn intensely. The English set them ablaze and sent them drifting toward the anchored Spanish fleet on the tide and wind. Spanish sentries saw the burning ships coming. Alarm spread through the fleet. Crews scrambled to their ships. Some Spanish ships sent boats to try to tow the fire ships away, but panic was spreading. Commanders, fearing the fire ships would explode or set the fleet ablaze, ordered anchor cables cut. Ships began moving away from the fire ships in the darkness. The fire ships didn't actually hit any Spanish vessels. Spanish boats managed to tow them away. But the damage was done. The Spanish fleet had been scattered. Ships were dispersed in the darkness, formation broken, some ships drifting on currents. By morning of August 8th, the Armada was in disarray. Systems were scattered along the coast. The defensive formation that had protected them for a week was gone, and the English fleet was ready to attack. August 8th, 1588, the day of the Battle of Gravelines, would be the decisive engagement of the Spanish Armada campaign. This was the moment when Spanish dreams of conquering England would be shattered. Dawn revealed the Spanish fleet scattered and disorganized after the fireship attack. Medina Sidonia tried desperately to rally his ships and reform the defensive formation. Some ships responded, gathering around the flagship. but many were scattered along the coast, some driven dangerously close to the shoals and sandbanks that made these waters treacherous. The English fleet, reinforced by additional ships that had joined during the night, saw their opportunity. This was the moment to attack with full force while the Spanish were vulnerable. Around 9 in the morning, the English fleet attacked. Unlike the previous days of cautious engagement, this was all-out assault. English ships sailed directly toward the Spanish, closing to shorter range than before, pouring devastating fire into Spanish vessels. The fighting was intense and brutal. English ships would sail toward a Spanish vessel, fire broadsides at close range, then veer away to reload and attack again. Spanish ships tried to return fire, but English gunnery was superior. The English had been practicing rapid-fire gunnery for years. Their gun crews could reload and fire much faster than Spanish crews. An English ship might fire its guns 3 or 4 times in the time it took a Spanish ship to fire once. This rate of fire, combined with the English tactic of attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, meant Spanish ships were being hammered by continuous cannon fire. Spanish ships suffered terrible damage. Hulls were breached. Masts and rigging were destroyed. Decks were shattered. Casualties mounted as cannonballs crashed through ships, killing and maiming sailors and soldiers. Several Spanish ships were pounded until they were nearly sinking. The San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, was attacked by multiple English ships and suffered severe damage. Medina Sidonia himself narrowly escaped death several times as shots crashed through his cabin. The Spanish tried to fight back. Their soldiers lined the rails, firing muskets at English ships. Their cannon returned fire when they could. Some Spanish ships tried to close and board English vessels, their best hope of using superior numbers. But English ships were too fast. They'd sail close, unleash broadsides, then dance away before Spanish could grapple them. The Spanish couldn't bring their strength, their soldiers, into play if they couldn't close with enemy ships. The Battle of Gravelines raged for about 8 hours, from morning until late afternoon. The intensity was extraordinary. Ships emerged from the smoke of cannon fire, only to be hit by more broadsides. The sea was covered with debris, broken masts, shattered timber, bodies. The English were running out of ammunition. They'd been fighting for over a week, and now this intense battle had depleted their remaining supplies. Some English ships fired their last shots and had to withdraw because they had nothing left to fire. But the damage to the Spanish was severe. Multiple ships were sinking or so badly damaged they could barely sail. Casualties were in the hundreds, possibly over 1,000 killed or wounded. As evening approached, the wind shifted. A strong wind began blowing from the southwest, pushing the Spanish fleet toward the northeast, toward the shoals and sandbanks of the Dutch and Flemish coast. This was extremely dangerous. If Spanish ships were driven onto the shoals, they'd be wrecked. The Spanish needed to sail away from the coast, but the wind was against them. Medina Sidonia faced a critical decision. He'd been ordered to link up with Parma's army and invade England. But his fleet was damaged, scattered, and being driven toward dangerous shoals. Parma's army still hadn't appeared. The Dutch blockade was preventing embarkation. The invasion plan was clearly failing. Staying in the Channel meant more English attacks and possible destruction on the shoals. But retreating meant abandoning the mission. Medina Sidonia chose survival over mission. He ordered the fleet to sail north, away from England, around Scotland and Ireland, and back to Spain by the long route. This was an admission of defeat. The Armada was giving up on invading England and trying to get home. But the retreat would prove almost as devastating as the battle. The damaged Spanish ships, overcrowded and short on supplies, would face horrific conditions on the long journey home. The English fleet followed the Armada north for several days. Harassing but not attacking in force, they were out of ammunition. When it became clear the Spanish were definitely leaving and not turning back to attack, the English let them go. England had been saved. The invasion was defeated. The invincible Armada had been beaten by a smaller English fleet, by superior English tactics, and by luck with the weather. But for the Spanish, the ordeal wasn't over. The retreat around Scotland and Ireland would be a nightmare. After the Battle of Gravelines, the damaged Spanish Armada sailed north, trying to get home by sailing around Scotland and Ireland, rather than fighting their way back through the English Channel. This route around the British Isles was much longer and more dangerous, but it was the only option. The Spanish fleet couldn't fight its way back through the Channel with damaged ships and depleted ammunition. What followed was one of the worst disasters in naval history. The combination of storm, starvation, disease, and shipwreck would kill more Spanish sailors than English guns had. As the Armada sailed north around Scotland, the weather deteriorated. August turned to September, and the North Atlantic showed its fury. Storms battered the Spanish fleet. These weren't ordinary bad weather. These were violent North Atlantic storms with massive waves, howling winds, and driving rain. The Spanish ships, many already damaged from battle, struggled to survive. Sails were torn away, masts snapped. Ships leaked from battle damage and from being pounded by waves. Pumps worked constantly to keep ships from sinking. The overcrowding made everything worse. 30,000 men had sailed with the Armada. Thousands had been killed or wounded in battle, but most were still alive, packed onto ships designed for smaller crews. In the storms, there was nowhere for men to shelter properly. They huddled below decks in cramped, wet spaces. Seasickness was universal. Men were vomiting, fouling the already disgusting conditions. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, spread by lice in the unsanitary, crowded conditions, killed hundreds. Dysentery from contaminated food and water was rampant. Men weakened by hunger, cold, and exhaustion had no resistance to disease. The food supplies were nearly exhausted, and what remained was spoiled. The salted meat was rotten. The water in barrels was contaminated. Men were eating food that made them sick and drinking water that gave them dysentery. Some ships ran out of food entirely. Men were starving, reduced to eating rats, leather, and anything remotely edible. The water rations were cut to tiny amounts, barely enough to survive. In these conditions, with storms raging and ships damaged, navigation was extremely difficult. Pilots tried to keep ships away from the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland, but in the storms and fog, it was hard to know exactly where they were. And here's where the catastrophe became complete. Multiple Spanish ships were driven onto the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, where they were wrecked on rocks or beaches. The Irish coast was particularly deadly. Ireland was under English control, and the English authorities had ordered that Spanish sailors who came ashore should be killed. When Spanish ships wrecked on the Irish coast, survivors struggling ashore faced two dangers: the hostile local population and English soldiers sent to execute Spanish survivors. Thousands of Spanish sailors drowned in shipwrecks. Thousands more made it to shore, only to be killed by local people or English troops. Some were robbed and murdered for whatever possessions they carried. Others were rounded up and executed systematically. Not all Irish people were hostile. Some tried to help Spanish survivors, hiding them or providing food. But English authorities were offering rewards for captured Spanish sailors and threatening punishment for anyone helping them. The wrecks on the Irish coast became sights of horror. Bodies washed up on beaches for weeks. The remains of ships, timber, cargo, bodies littered the coastline. Of the roughly 130 ships that had sailed with the Armada, fewer than 70 made it back to Spain. Over 60 ships were lost, sunk in battle, wrecked in storms, or abandoned when they became unseaworthy. Of the approximately 30,000 men who'd sailed with the Armada, perhaps 15,000 made it back to Spain. About 15,000 died from battle, storm, shipwreck, disease, starvation, or murder after coming ashore in Ireland. The ships that did make it back to Spanish ports arrived in terrible condition. They were battered wrecks, barely able to stay afloat. The crews were sick, starving, and traumatized. When Medina Sidonia finally reached Spain in September, he was devastated by the disaster. He'd commanded the greatest fleet ever assembled, and it had been destroyed. About half the ships and half the men were gone. He wrote to Philip II, describing the catastrophe, expecting to be punished for failure. But Philip, to his credit, didn't blame Medina Sidonia. Philip wrote back that the disaster was God's will, not human failure. Philip's response reflected a profound religious faith, but also a recognition that the disaster was beyond anyone's control. The Armada had been defeated, not just by English resistance, but by weather, disease, and circumstances that even Spain's mighty empire couldn't overcome. The English, watching Spanish ships struggle past Scotland and hearing reports of wrecks on Irish coasts, were jubilant. England had been saved. The invasion had been defeated. Protestant England saw divine intervention in the storms that battered the Spanish fleet. They called it the Protestant wind, God's wind that destroyed the Catholic Armada and saved Protestant England. Medals were struck commemorating the victory, with the Latin inscription Flavit Jehovah et dissipati sunt. God blew and they were scattered. The English interpreted their victory as proof of divine favor. This was the same belief system the Spanish had. Both sides believed God was on their side. Both interpreted events as divine judgment. The English just happened to be the ones who won. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was complete. The greatest naval force ever assembled had been scattered, defeated, and largely destroyed. Spain's plan to invade England had failed catastrophically. But what did this defeat mean? What were the consequences for Spain, for England, for Europe, and for America? In the immediate aftermath of the Armada's defeat, both England and Spain tried to understand what had happened and what it meant for their futures. In England, there was jubilation. The country had faced the greatest threat in its history, invasion by the world's superpower, and had survived. The relief and celebration were enormous. Queen Elizabeth I became a national hero. She'd stood firm against Spanish intimidation, refused to submit to Catholic pressure, and led England through the crisis. Her popularity soared. Elizabeth gave a famous speech at Tilbury, where English land forces had assembled to resist invasion. She declared, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." This speech, emphasizing her determination to fight alongside her people, became legendary. Elizabeth's image as the defender of England was cemented. The naval commanders became national heroes. Drake, already famous for his privateering, was now celebrated as one of the saviours of England. Howard, Hawkins, Frobisher all received honours and celebration. The victory was commemorated in art, literature, and public celebrations. It became central to English national identity, the moment when Little England defeated mighty Spain, when Protestant truth overcame Catholic oppression, when English courage and skill triumphed against overwhelming odds. But the reality was more complex than celebratory narratives suggested. England had survived, but the war with Spain wasn't over. Philip II, though stunned by the disaster, wasn't giving up. Spain still had vast resources. The Armada had been destroyed, but Spain could build more ships. The American silver mines still produced wealth. Spanish armies still occupied the Netherlands. Philip immediately began planning to rebuild the Spanish fleet. He ordered new ships constructed, new crews trained, supplies accumulated. Spain would recover from the disaster. Moreover, England faced serious problems. The war with Spain was expensive. English finances were strained. The country needed to maintain defences, knowing Spain might try again. English ships and sailors had been pushed to their limits. Many ships needed repairs, crews were exhausted. Some sailors had died from disease, even on the victorious English side. The privateering continued. Drake and other English commanders led new raids on Spanish territories in 1589, trying to capitalize on Spanish weakness. But these raids were less successful than hoped and didn't achieve strategic goals. In Spain, the defeat was devastating but not crippling. Yes, it was a disaster. Yes, about half the Armada had been lost. But Spain was enormous and wealthy. The empire continued functioning. Philip II took the defeat as God's judgment. Perhaps God wanted Spain to be more pure, more faithful, more prepared before achieving victory over Protestant heresy. He didn't abandon his goal of defeating England, he just adjusted his timeline. Spain would rebuild, prepare better, and try again. The Spanish did launch more armadas in the 1590s. These subsequent attempts were smaller and less ambitious than the 1588 Armada, and they were all defeated by storms, English resistance, or tactical failures. But the fact that Spain kept trying shows the defeat of the 1588 Armada, while significant, didn't end Spanish power or Spanish ambitions. For the people most directly affected, the Spanish sailors and soldiers who survived, the Armada was personal tragedy. Thousands had died horrible deaths. Survivors were traumatized, sick, and often wounded. Many survivors never fully recovered. Disease, injuries, and psychological trauma affected them for the rest of their lives. The disaster destroyed families. Fathers, sons, brothers lost. Spanish ports received the survivors with mixed emotions. Pride in their bravery, horror at the disaster, grief for the losses, and uncertainty about what it meant for Spain's future. For England, the victory provided security and confidence. England now knew it could defend itself against Spain. This knowledge encouraged English merchants, explorers, and colonizers to be more ambitious. English privateering intensified. If Spain couldn't defend its treasure fleets against English raids, then raiding became even more profitable and less risky. English colonization efforts, which had been cautious because of Spanish threats, became bolder. If Spain couldn't conquer England, maybe Spain couldn't prevent English colonies in territories Spain claimed. This connects directly to American history. Remember John White and the Lost Colony? White had been stuck in England during 1588 because the Armada crisis prevented him from returning to Roanoke. The Roanoke colonists disappeared partly because the Armada delayed support. If the Armada crisis hadn't occurred, White might have returned with supplies in time to save the colony. But the Armada's defeat also cleared the way for future English colonization. After 1588, England felt more confident challenging Spanish claims to American territories. When Jamestown was founded in 1607, part of the investors' confidence came from knowing that the Armada had been defeated. Spain couldn't prevent English colonization the way they'd prevented French colonization at Fort Caroline. The defeat of the Armada didn't immediately end Spanish power, but it began a gradual shift in European power dynamics that would continue for decades. Spain remained a great power through the 17th century, but the trajectory was downward. The costs of maintaining the empire, fighting wars in Europe, and defending against England, France, and the Dutch gradually weakened Spain. England, meanwhile, was rising. English naval power grew. English trade expanded. English colonies spread throughout the world. The defeat of the Armada became a founding myth for English and later British naval supremacy. The Royal Navy would dominate the seas for centuries, and this dominance traced back to 1588. For European Protestantism, the defeat of the Armada was enormously important. If Spain had conquered England, Protestantism in Northern Europe would have been threatened. England was the most powerful Protestant nation. Its survival ensured Protestantism's survival. The defeat also affected religious warfare throughout Europe. Catholic powers couldn't count on Spanish military might being invincible. Protestant resistance seemed more viable after England had defeated Spain. The immediate aftermath of the Armada was thus complex. Jubilation in England, devastation in Spain, but the longer-term consequences still unfolding. The war between England and Spain would continue for another 16 years, until peace in 1604. But 1588 marked a turning point. Spanish invincibility was shattered, English confidence was established, and the balance of power in Europe began shifting in ways that would shape the next centuries. The defeat of the Spanish Armada became more than just a military victory. It became a providential event, interpreted through religious lenses by both Catholics and Protestants. Let's explore how religion shaped understanding of what happened in 1588. For English Protestants, the Armada's defeat was unmistakable divine intervention. God had saved Protestant England from Catholic Spain. The storms that battered the Spanish fleet were God's storms, sent to destroy heretics and protect the faithful. This interpretation wasn't just popular belief, it was official narrative. Elizabeth I's government promoted the idea that God had fought for England. The commemorative medals with "God blew and they were scattered" made this explicit. Preachers across England delivered sermons declaring the Armada's defeat as proof of God's favour toward Protestant England and judgment against Catholic Spain. Church services gave thanks to God for deliverance. The Protestant wind became part of English national mythology. Wind and weather had been crucial to defeating the Armada. The storms that scattered the fleet during the fireship attack, the wind that pushed Spanish ships toward the shoals at Gravelines, the violent storms during the retreat around Scotland and Ireland. Without these weather events, the English might not have won. English tactics were effective, but weather multiplied their effect and made Spanish defeat catastrophic. For Protestant England, this wasn't coincidence, it was providence. God controlled the weather, and God had used weather to defend Protestant truth against Catholic aggression. This providential interpretation served important purposes. It united England religiously and nationally. It validated Elizabeth's religious settlement. It encouraged English people to see themselves as God's chosen people with a divine mission. It also provided comfort and confidence. If God had saved England once, God would do so again. English people could face future threats, knowing divine power was on their side. But here's the interesting thing. Spanish Catholics used the exact same theological framework, just with different conclusions. For Spanish Catholics, the Armada's defeat was also divine action, but it was divine punishment. God had allowed the defeat because Spain wasn't faithful enough, wasn't pure enough, wasn't worthy of victory. Philip II interpreted the disaster this way. He believed God was testing Spain, purifying Spain through suffering, preparing Spain for eventual victory once the country had proven its faithfulness. This interpretation actually sustained Spanish determination. The defeat wasn't proof that God opposed Spain. It was proof that God was training Spain for greater service. Spain needed to be more devout, more committed, more prepared. Spanish preachers delivered sermons calling for national repentance, greater religious devotion, and renewed commitment to defending Catholicism. The Armada's defeat became a call to deeper faith, not a reason to give up. Both sides interpreted the same events through their religious worldviews and reached opposite conclusions, both claiming divine support. This shows how powerful interpretive frameworks are. The facts were clear. The Armada was defeated. English tactics were effective. Storms battered Spanish ships. But the meaning of these facts depended on the religious lens through which they were viewed. Modern historians can analyze the Armada's defeat in terms of tactics, logistics, technology, leadership, and weather without invoking divine intervention. We can see that English gunnery was superior, that Spanish planning had critical flaws, that storms were meteorologically normal for North Atlantic in August-September. But for people in 1588, these natural explanations weren't sufficient. They needed theological explanations because they understood the world primarily through religious categories. The Armada campaign was, after all, explicitly religious. Philip II saw himself as defending Catholicism. Elizabeth I was defending Protestantism. Both sides believed God cared about the outcome and would intervene. When dramatic weather events occurred at crucial moments, the storms were interpreted as divine action, not as coincidence or normal weather. The Protestant wind narrative had lasting effects on English culture. It contributed to English exceptionalism, the belief that England was special, chosen by God, destined for greatness. This exceptionalism would shape English colonization. When English colonizers went to America, they carried this sense of divine favor. They believed God wanted English Protestant civilization to spread, that their colonization was divinely ordained. The providential interpretation of the Armada also created a template for understanding future English victories. When England won subsequent conflicts, these too were seen as divine favor. Over centuries, this contributed to British imperial ideology, the idea that British power was morally justified because God supported Britain. This ideology would be used to justify empire, colonization, and domination of other peoples. Of course, this ideology was self-serving and historically problematic. Divine favor was claimed by whoever won and used to justify violence and exploitation. But understanding how the Armada was interpreted religiously helps us see how deeply religion shaped early modern politics and how religious narratives influence later historical developments. The Protestant wind was real weather, North Atlantic storms that battered ships, but it was also cultural construct, a religious interpretation that gave meaning to weather events and shaped how English people understood their identity and destiny. For Spanish, the same storms were divine punishment, requiring repentance and renewed faith. For English, they were divine protection, rewarding faithfulness. Neither interpretation was objectively correct. They were different ways of finding meaning in catastrophic events within religious worldviews that took divine intervention for granted. Modern understanding doesn't require choosing between these religious interpretations. We can analyze the Armada's defeat in secular terms while recognizing that religious interpretations were how people in 1588 actually understood what was happening. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was a military and naval event, but it was also a religious event, a cultural event, a psychological event, one that shaped how English and Spanish people thought about God, about themselves, about their place in history. Understanding these religious dimensions enriches our understanding of why the Armada mattered so much, why it's remembered so powerfully, and how it shaped subsequent history beyond its immediate military consequences. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 didn't immediately destroy Spanish power. Spain remained a major European power for decades. But the Armada marked the beginning of a long, gradual decline that would eventually reduce Spain from superpower to secondary status. Let's understand how the Armada defeat contributed to Spain's decline and what this meant for European power dynamics. First, the financial cost was staggering. Building the Armada had required enormous investment, constructing ships, recruiting crews, accumulating supplies, paying soldiers and sailors. Estimates suggest the Armada cost Spain around 10 million ducats, an astronomical sum. For context, Spain's annual revenues were maybe 10 to 12 million ducats total. The Armada consumed nearly a full year's worth of Spanish government income, and then half of it was destroyed. About 60 ships lost, 15,000 men dead, enormous quantities of weapons, ammunition, and supplies gone. Spain got almost no return on this massive investment. Philip II immediately began rebuilding the fleet, which required additional enormous expenditures. The 1590s saw Spain trying to maintain military operations throughout Europe, while also rebuilding naval forces. This financial strain was compounded by other pressures. Spain was fighting the Dutch Revolt, an expensive, decades-long war in the Netherlands. Spain was involved in French religious wars, supporting Catholic factions. Spain was maintaining garrisons and administrations throughout its vast empire. All of this cost money. And while Spanish America provided silver from mines in Mexico and Peru, this revenue wasn't infinite. More importantly, much of it was already committed to paying debts and financing ongoing military operations. The Armada's defeat meant Spain had spent an enormous sum and achieved nothing. No conquest of England, no elimination of Protestant threat, no strategic gain. It was pure loss. The human cost was equally significant. 15,000 men dead was a substantial portion of Spain's experienced sailors and soldiers. These weren't easily replaced. Naval expertise takes years to develop. Experienced sailors who understand ships, navigation, and naval tactics are valuable. Spain lost thousands of these experienced men in 1588. Replacing them required training new sailors, which took time and money. The Spanish Navy in the 1590s was less experienced and less effective than before the Armada, partly because so much institutional knowledge had been lost. The psychological impact was also important. Spain had believed its military was invincible. Spanish armies had been extremely successful throughout the 16th century, conquering the Americas, defeating Protestant forces in Europe, dominating Mediterranean warfare. The Armada's defeat shattered this sense of invincibility. Spain could lose. Spanish military might could be defeated. Spanish planning could fail catastrophically. This psychological shift affected Spanish confidence and affected how other powers viewed Spain. Enemies became bolder. Allies became less reliable. Spain's ability to intimidate opponents through reputation was diminished. The defeat also revealed strategic weaknesses in Spanish planning and coordination. The Armada plan required perfect coordination between the fleet and Parma's army in the Netherlands. This coordination failed. Communication was too slow and unreliable. Parma couldn't get his army embarked in time. The Dutch blockade prevented Spanish forces from leaving port. The plan had assumed everything would work perfectly, and when it didn't, there was no backup plan. This revealed that Spain's strategic planning had serious flaws. Complex operations requiring precise coordination across long distances were extremely difficult in the 16th century. Future Spanish military operations would struggle with similar coordination problems, contributing to strategic failures in the coming decades. The defeat also emboldened Spain's enemies. England, having defeated the Armada, became more aggressive. English privateering intensified. English colonial ventures became bolder. The Dutch Revolt, which had been struggling, gained new momentum. If Spain couldn't defeat England, maybe Spain could be defeated in the Netherlands too. Dutch resistance stiffened. France, embroiled in religious civil wars, saw that Spain wasn't invincible. French factions became less afraid of Spanish intervention. Spain faced a more hostile, more confident coalition of enemies after 1588. And fighting multiple enemies simultaneously drained Spanish resources and overstretched Spanish military forces. The economic burden of continuous warfare was unsustainable. Spain declared bankruptcy multiple times in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, 1596, 1607, 1627, 1647. Each bankruptcy disrupted government finances, damaged Spanish credit, and made borrowing more expensive. The bankruptcies were partly caused by the enormous military expenditures Spain maintained, trying to defend its empire and maintain its position as Europe's dominant power. The Armada defeat contributed to this financial crisis by consuming resources without providing returns and by encouraging enemies to challenge Spain more aggressively, requiring Spain to spend even more on defense. Spain's economic model was also problematic. The empire depended heavily on American silver, but this silver enriched Spain only temporarily. Much of it flowed out to pay for imports and to pay debts to foreign bankers. Spain never developed strong domestic industries. Spanish manufacturing couldn't compete with English, Dutch, or French production. Spain imported manufactured goods and paid with American silver, enriching its trading partners while remaining dependent. The Armada defeat didn't cause these structural economic problems, but it exacerbated them by draining resources that might have been invested productively. Population decline also hurt Spain. Wars, plagues, and emigration to the Americas reduced Spain's population through the late 16th and 17th centuries. Fewer people meant less tax revenue and fewer soldiers. The Armada killed 15,000 Spanish men, a significant demographic loss that Spain couldn't easily absorb. By the early 17th century, Spain was clearly in relative decline. Spain remained a great power, still controlling vast territories, still wealthy, still influential. But the trajectory was downward. Other powers, England, France, the Netherlands, were rising. These countries were developing more effective governments, stronger economies, more innovative militaries. Spain, burdened by the costs of empire and by continuous warfare, couldn't keep pace with these rising powers. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, would further drain Spain. Spanish involvement in this devastating European religious war consumed enormous resources and achieved little strategic gain. By the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Spain was clearly a declining power. Spanish dominance in Europe was over, though Spain would remain important through the 17th century. The Armada of 1588 didn't cause this decline alone, but it was an important moment, the point where Spanish invincibility was shattered, where Spain's strategic limitations were revealed, where the trajectory toward decline became evident. If the Armada had succeeded, if England had been conquered, if Protestantism had been crushed, Spain might have consolidated its dominance. Spanish power might have continued ascending. But the Armada failed, and in that failure, the seeds of Spanish decline were planted. Spain would spend the next century trying to maintain a position it could no longer afford, fighting wars it couldn't win, defending an empire that was slowly slipping away. The defeat of the Spanish Armada thus marked not just a single battle's outcome, but the beginning of a long historical process, the decline of Spanish power, and the rise of other European nations to challenge and eventually surpass Spain. Understanding this long-term impact helps us see the Armada's defeat as more than just an exciting military event. It was a turning point in European history, shifting the balance of power in ways that would shape the next centuries. While Spain was beginning its long decline, England was beginning its rise to become a dominant global power. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was crucial to this transformation. Let's explore how England built on its 1588 victory. Before the Armada, England was a mid-sized European power, important but not dominant. England was smaller than France, less wealthy than Spain, less populous than the Holy Roman Empire. English military forces were modest. The navy was effective but small. The army was tiny by continental European standards. England couldn't compete with the massive Spanish armies or the powerful French forces. But England had advantages that would prove crucial in the coming centuries. Island geography provided natural defences. Invading England required naval supremacy. Strong naval traditions meant English sailors were skilled and experienced. A developing merchant economy was creating wealth and naval infrastructure. The Armada's defeat validated England's strategic approach. Rather than trying to match Spain's massive land armies, England focused on naval power. The success of English tactics in 1588, faster ships, better gunnery, superior seamanship, showed this approach worked. After 1588, England invested heavily in naval development. More ships were built, naval gunnery was refined, tactics were improved. England was systematically building the navy that would eventually rule the seas. English privateering became even more aggressive after the Armada. If Spain couldn't protect its treasure fleets in 1588, then attacking Spanish shipping was profitable and relatively safe. Drake and other privateers launched new raids in the 1590s. These raids were hit and miss, some successful, some failing, but they kept pressure on Spain and brought wealth to England. More importantly, privateering developed English naval expertise. English sailors learned to navigate long distances, to fight effectively, to manage ships in difficult conditions. This experience would prove invaluable. English commerce expanded dramatically after 1588. English merchants, no longer fearing Spanish conquest, invested more confidently in overseas trade. The English East India Company was founded in 1600, just 12 years after the Armada. This company would eventually dominate trade with Asia and become a cornerstone of British imperial power. English trading posts were established throughout the world, in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, North America. English merchants competed aggressively with Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish traders. This commercial expansion created wealth that funded further military and naval development. A virtuous cycle developed. Commerce created wealth, wealth funded naval power protected commerce and enabled further expansion. English colonization also accelerated after the Armada. Before 1588, English colonial attempts had been cautious and largely unsuccessful, Roanoke being the prime example. But after 1588, knowing Spain couldn't prevent English colonization, investors became more confident. The Virginia Company was chartered in 1606, leading to Jamestown's founding in 1607. Plymouth followed in 1620, Massachusetts Bay in 1630. Over the 17th century, England established numerous colonies in North America and the Caribbean. These colonies would eventually become extraordinarily valuable, providing resources, creating markets for English goods, serving as bases for English naval power. The Armada's defeat made this colonization possible. If Spain had conquered England in 1588, there would be no English colonies. If England had remained fearful of Spanish retaliation, colonization would have been too risky. But Spain's failure emboldened England. English colonizers believed they could challenge Spanish claims to American territories and succeed. English cultural confidence grew after 1588. Before the Armada, England had been somewhat insecure, aware of being smaller and less powerful than Spain or France. After 1588, England saw itself as God's chosen nation, defended by Providence, destined for greatness. This cultural confidence encouraged ambition, risk-taking, and expansion. The Elizabethan era, roughly 1560 to 1603, became remembered as a golden age. English literature flourished. Shakespeare was writing during and after the Armada period. English culture was vibrant and self-confident. This cultural flowering wasn't caused by the Armada alone, but the sense of national confidence after defeating Spain certainly contributed. English naval traditions developed that would last centuries. The Royal Navy traced its proud history to the defeat of the Armada. English sailors saw themselves as heirs to the men who defeated the invincible Armada. This tradition of naval excellence became central to British identity. "Britannia rules the waves" wasn't just a song, it was national ideology rooted in 1588. By the mid-17th century, England was clearly a major naval power. The Anglo-Dutch wars of the 1650s to 1670s pitted England against the Netherlands, another rising naval power, for maritime supremacy. England didn't win all these conflicts, but held its own and continued developing naval capabilities. By the early 18th century, Britain, England and Scotland unified in 1707, was emerging as the dominant naval power. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, confirmed British naval dominance. Britain defeated France in global conflict, winning control of Canada, India, and other territories. British naval superiority was decisive in this victory. By the late 18th century, the Royal Navy was unquestionably the world's most powerful naval force. This supremacy would last through the 19th century and into the 20th. The path from 1588 to this later naval supremacy wasn't inevitable. England could have failed to capitalize on the Armada victory. Other powers could have developed superior naval forces, but England did capitalize on the victory. The investment in naval power, the expansion of commerce, the development of colonies, the cultural confidence, all built on the foundation laid in 1588. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was thus not just about survival, but about opportunity. England survived the invasion attempt, but more importantly, England gained confidence and momentum that drove expansion for centuries. There's historical irony here. Philip II sent the Armada to crush England and end English interference in Spanish affairs. Instead, the Armada's defeat launched England on the path to becoming Spain's successor as dominant global power. Spain, trying to maintain its empire through military force, gradually declined. England, building naval power and commercial networks, gradually rose. By the 19th century, this role reversal was complete. Britain ruled the largest empire in world history. Spain was a minor European power, having lost most of its American territories to independence movements. The seeds of this reversal were planted in 1588. The Armada's defeat didn't immediately make England dominant, but it started the processes, naval development, commercial expansion, colonial settlement, that would eventually create British global supremacy. Understanding England's rise after 1588 helps us see the Armada's defeat as more than just a battle won. It was an inflection point where historical trajectories shifted. Spain declining, England rising, and the balance of global power beginning a transformation that would reshape the world. For American history specifically, England's rise meant English colonies would spread throughout North America. The language, culture, laws, and institutions that would shape the United States trace back to English colonization enabled by Spain's 1588 defeat. If the Armada had succeeded, there would be no United States as we know it. North America might be Spanish, or divided among European powers differently, or developed entirely different political structures. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was thus foundational to American history, not because it happened in America, but because it enabled the English colonization that would eventually create the United States. Now let's connect the Spanish Armada directly to American history through the story we explored in Episode 6, The Lost Colony of Roanoke. Remember John White? He was the governor of the 1587 Roanoke colony who left his family and 115 colonists to get supplies from England, planning to return quickly. Instead, he couldn't return for 3 years, and when he finally did, the colonists had vanished. The Spanish Armada is the reason White couldn't return. This European conflict, thousands of miles away, directly caused the abandonment of English colonists in America. Let's understand exactly how this happened. White left Roanoke in late August 1587, sailing back to England on one of the ships that had brought the colonists. He expected to organize a supply expedition and return to Roanoke by early 1588, maybe spring at the latest. The colonists were counting on him. They had inadequate supplies. They'd arrived too late in the season to plant sufficient crops. They needed food, tools, weapons, and reinforcements to survive. White arrived in England in November 1587 and immediately began organizing a supply expedition. He contacted Sir Walter Raleigh, who'd financed the colony. He gathered supplies. He found ships willing to make the voyage. By spring 1588, White had everything ready. 2 supply ships, the Brave and the Roe, were loaded with food, tools, weapons, and other necessities for Roanoke. But then, in March 1588, Queen Elizabeth issued her stay order. No ships could leave English ports. Every vessel and every sailor was needed for national defense. The Spanish Armada was coming. White pleaded for an exception. Just 2 small supply ships, he argued. The colonists would die without supplies. But his pleas were denied. From the government's perspective, the decision was obvious. England faced existential threat. If Spain conquered England, it wouldn't matter what happened to 115 colonists in America. National survival took absolute priority. White was desperate. His daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, just born when he left. The other colonists he governed, all depended on supplies he couldn't send. In April 1588, White finally got permission for the Brave and Roe to sail, supposedly to relocate the colony. But when these 2 ships left port, they didn't head straight for America. They attempted privateering on the way, attacking French ships to pay for the expedition. This proved disastrous. They encountered more powerful French warships, were badly damaged in the fighting, and had to limp back to England. White was wounded in this fight, shot in the buttocks, which was painful and humiliating, but not life-threatening. More tragically, the expedition failed completely without even reaching America. By the time the ships returned to England in May 1588, the Armada crisis was intensifying. Spain's massive fleet was preparing to sail. England was mobilizing every resource for defense. Through the summer of 1588, while the Armada sailed up the English Channel and English ships fought desperate battles, White could only wait helplessly in England. The colonists at Roanoke had no idea what was happening or why supplies weren't coming. After the Armada was defeated and began its catastrophic retreat in August 1588, White hoped he could finally organize a supply expedition. But England was exhausted. Ships were damaged. Sailors were sick or dead. Resources were depleted. Moreover, war with Spain continued. The Armada's defeat didn't end the conflict. Spain was rebuilding its fleet. English forces were preparing for possible future attacks. Ships couldn't be spared for colonial ventures. White spent 1589 desperately trying to find ships and funding. But no one wanted to invest in supplying a colony that had been abandoned for 2 years. The colonists were probably dead. Why waste resources on a failed venture? Raleigh, who'd financed the original expedition, had fallen out of favor with Elizabeth over a secret marriage. He was dealing with personal and political problems and couldn't focus resources on Roanoke. Finally, in March 1590, White managed to join a privateering expedition that agreed to stop at Roanoke on the way to raiding Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. This wasn't ideal. The privateers would give him limited time at Roanoke, and they wouldn't provide substantial supplies. But it was White's only option. The expedition didn't reach Roanoke until August 1590, exactly 3 years after White had left the colonists. 3 years without supplies. 3 years without reinforcements. 3 years wondering if they'd been abandoned. What White found when he arrived, the empty settlement, the word Croatoan carved on a post, no sign of his family, we've already explored. But understanding the Armada's role helps us see that the colonists' disappearance wasn't random misfortune. It was directly caused by European geopolitics. The colonists probably left Roanoke, moving to Croatoan Island or elsewhere, because they realized supplies weren't coming. They couldn't survive at Roanoke without support. They had to adapt or die. If the Armada crisis hadn't occurred, White would have returned with supplies in 1588. The colony might have survived. Virginia Dare might have grown up in English America. The lost colony wouldn't be lost. The Armada's impact on Roanoke shows how interconnected history is. European conflicts affected American colonization directly. Events thousands of miles away determined the fates of colonists trying to build new lives. This pattern would repeat throughout colonial history. European wars, European politics, European economics, all directly affected American colonies. Colonists weren't isolated pioneers independent of European affairs. They were participants in global systems where distant events shaped local outcomes. The Armada also taught English colonizers important lessons about colonial support. Roanoke failed partly because support was interrupted. Later colonies, Jamestown, Plymouth, benefited from more consistent support, partly because investors and organizers had learned from Roanoke's failure. The Virginia Company, which founded Jamestown in 1607, maintained more regular supply ships. Even when Jamestown faced the starving time in 1609–1610, supply ships did eventually arrive. The colony survived. Plymouth Colony in 1620 was founded by a religious community with strong commitment to mutual support. The Pilgrims weren't dependent on a single organizer like Raleigh. Community commitment helped ensure support continued. These lessons came partly from Roanoke's failure, and Roanoke's failure came partly from the Armada crisis. There's tragic irony in this connection. The Armada was sent partly to stop English colonization in territories Spain claimed. The Armada failed to conquer England, but it did succeed in destroying the Roanoke colony by preventing support from reaching the colonists. Spain didn't need to attack Roanoke directly. Spanish forces never came near the colony. The Armada destroyed Roanoke indirectly by consuming English resources and attention at the crucial moment when colonists needed support. For the colonists at Roanoke, the reason for abandonment didn't matter. They didn't know about the Armada. They just knew supplies didn't come. They had to make desperate choices: move somewhere else, integrate with indigenous peoples, struggle to survive however they could. Their fates remain unknown, but their struggle was caused partly by a European naval battle they never witnessed, fought for reasons they probably barely understood. This is the human cost of geopolitics. When great powers conflict, ordinary people caught in the consequences suffer. The Roanoke colonists were victims of Spanish-English rivalry as much as any sailors who died in the Channel battles. Understanding this connection helps us see the Armada's impact beyond the immediate military confrontation. The Armada shaped American history by destroying one colonial attempt and by clearing the way, after its defeat, for future attempts. Roanoke failed, but Jamestown succeeded, and England's confidence after defeating the Armada was crucial to Jamestown's founding. The Virginia Company investors were willing to risk money on American colonization, partly because Spain had been defeated. The Spanish Armada of 1588 thus connects directly to the founding of English America, not through immediate presence, but through chains of causation stretching from European battlefields to American shores. The defeat of the Spanish Armada wasn't just about luck or weather. English victory came from superior tactics, better technology, and more effective use of available resources. Let's analyze the military and naval factors that determined the outcome. Ship design was crucial. Spanish galleons were built high, towering castles at bow and stern, multiple decks rising above the waterline. This design served Spanish tactics. The height gave soldiers advantageous firing positions to shoot down onto enemy ships during boarding actions. Spanish naval combat emphasized boarding. Ships would close with enemies, grapple them, and Spanish soldiers would swarm aboard to fight hand to hand. Spain had superior numbers of soldiers and superior infantry tactics. Boarding played to Spanish strengths. English ships were built lower and sleeker. The English race-built galleons, developed in the 1570s, the 1580s, were faster and more maneuverable than Spanish designs. They sat lower in the water, making them less affected by wind and waves. English ships sacrificed height for speed and handling. This reflected different tactical priorities. English wanted to fight at distance with guns, not close for boarding. The lower profile had another advantage. It made English ships harder to hit with cannon fire. Spanish guns aimed from high platforms had to shoot downward at low-sitting English ships, difficult angles that affected accuracy. Artillery was another crucial difference. Both sides had cannon, but they were used very differently. Spanish cannon were primarily anti-personnel weapons. Spanish tactics assumed you'd close with the enemy and board. Cannon were used to kill enemy crews and damage rigging to slow enemy ships for boarding. Spanish cannon were typically heavy, short-ranged, and slow to reload. Spanish gunners were soldiers who happened to fire guns, not specialized artillery experts. English cannon were anti-ship weapons designed to damage and sink enemy vessels. English tactics emphasized fighting at distance, so English guns were designed for longer range and faster firing. English gun crews were more specialized and better trained. They could reload and fire much faster than Spanish crews, maybe 3 or 4 times as fast in some cases. This rate of fire was crucial in battle. An English ship could fire multiple broadsides, while a Spanish ship fired once. The accumulated damage was devastating. English guns were also better positioned on ships. The race-built galleons had gun ports designed for easy loading and firing. Spanish ships, built for boarding, had less optimal gun placement. Ammunition supply favored England. Fighting in home waters, English ships could resupply relatively easily. When ammunition ran low during the campaign, English ships could sail to nearby ports, take on more cannonballs and gunpowder, and return to battle. Spanish were far from their supply bases. The ammunition they carried was all they had. When it ran low, there was no way to resupply until returning to Spain. This logistical advantage meant English could sustain fire longer and more intensely than Spanish could. Tactics reflected these technological differences. Spanish formed defensive crescent, protecting vulnerable transport ships in the center. They maintained tight formation, mutual support, and tried to prevent English from isolating individual ships. This formation was effective defensively. English couldn't easily break through. But it was also rigid and slow. The entire fleet moved at the speed of the slowest ships. English used looser formation and more flexible tactics. English ships could detach, attack targets of opportunity, then rejoin the fleet. English captains had more initiative and independence. Drake and other English commanders used hit-and-run tactics. Sailing quickly, fire broadsides at close range, then retreat before Spanish could grapple and board. Repeat continuously, accumulating damage without risking close combat. Spanish couldn't counter this effectively. Their ships were too slow to catch English vessels. Their tactics required closing to boarding range, which English wouldn't allow. The fireship attack at Calais was brilliant improvisation. Fireships had been used in previous naval battles, but the scale and timing at Calais were perfect. Spanish were anchored tightly for mutual protection. They couldn't easily maneuver. The fireships, sent on wind and tide, threatened to burn the entire fleet. The Spanish response, cutting anchor cables and fleeing, was rational for individual ships, but disastrous for the fleet. Once formation was broken, Spanish lost their key defensive advantage. The Battle of Gravelines demonstrated English tactical superiority. With Spanish formation broken, English ships could attack more aggressively. They closed to shorter range, risking Spanish boarding, but inflicting massive damage. Spanish tried to fight back, but were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. The sustained English bombardment over 8 hours showed superior gunnery, ammunition supply, and tactical coordination. Leadership quality mattered too. English commanders, Howard, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher, were experienced seamen who understood naval combat intimately. They'd spent decades privateering, exploring, and fighting. Medina Sidonia, the Spanish commander, was competent and brave, but lacked naval experience. He'd been appointed partly for political reasons. He did his best in impossible circumstances, but he couldn't match English tactical expertise. Spanish tactical doctrine was also problematic. Philip II's orders to Medina Sidonia were rigid. Sail to Calais, link with Parma, invade England. There was little flexibility for adapting to circumstances. When the plan failed, when linking with Parma proved impossible, Medina Sidonia had no clear alternative. He improvised retreat, but the campaign had lost any chance of success. English doctrine was more flexible. Howard and Drake adjusted tactics as circumstances changed. When opportunities appeared, like the scattered Spanish fleet after the fireship attack, English commanders exploited them aggressively. Weather and seamanship also mattered. The English Channel in August can have changeable weather, calms, storms, shifting winds. English sailors knew these waters intimately. Spanish were operating far from home in unfamiliar waters. English had home field advantage, understanding tides, currents, and weather patterns better than Spanish. When critical weather moments occurred, wind shifts during the Battle of Gravelines, storms during the retreat, English were better positioned to exploit or survive them. Combining all these factors, ship design, artillery, tactics, leadership, logistics, weather, and seamanship, English had decisive advantages despite being outnumbered. The Armada wasn't defeated by any single factor. It was defeated by cumulative English advantages across multiple dimensions of naval warfare. This analysis matters for understanding naval history generally. The Armada campaign showed that quantity doesn't always beat quality. A smaller force with superior tactics and technology can defeat a larger force. It showed that fighting in home waters provides significant advantages. It showed that logistics, supply, ammunition, provisions can be decisive. It showed that tactical flexibility beats rigid doctrine. It showed that specialized skill, like English gunnery, beats general competence. These lessons influenced naval warfare for centuries. The Royal Navy's later dominance was built on principles proven in 1588. Superior ship design, better gunnery, flexible tactics, and control of home waters. The Spanish Armada campaign was a masterclass in naval warfare, teaching lessons that naval strategists studied for generations. The Spanish Armada plan required coordination between the fleet sailing from Spain and the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands. This coordination failed completely, dooming the invasion before the fleet even entered the Channel. Let's understand the Dutch dimension of this story. The Netherlands in 1588 was the site of the Dutch Revolt, a long, brutal war between Spanish forces trying to maintain control and Dutch rebels fighting for independence and religious freedom. The Spanish Netherlands, modern Belgium and the Netherlands, had been part of Spanish Habsburg territories. But in the 1560s, Dutch Protestants began rebelling against Spanish Catholic rule. Philip II sent armies to crush the rebellion. The Duke of Parma, Alexander Farnese, was the Spanish commander. He was one of the best military minds of the era, and his army was experienced and effective. By 1588, Parma controlled much of the southern Netherlands, modern Belgium, but the northern provinces, modern Netherlands, remained in rebel hands. The war was stalemated. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Philip II's Armada plan saw an opportunity to break the stalemate. If the Armada could transport Parma's army from the Netherlands to England, two objectives would be achieved simultaneously. First, England would be conquered, eliminating English support for Dutch rebels and potentially forcing Dutch submission once their Protestant ally was defeated. Second, Parma's army, about 30,000 experienced soldiers, would be the invasion force. These weren't raw recruits, but veterans of years of warfare in the Netherlands. They were arguably the best infantry force in Europe. The plan seemed logical on paper. The Armada would sail to Calais, meet Parma's forces, protect troop transports crossing the Channel, and overwhelm English defences with professional Spanish infantry. But the plan had fatal flaws that planners either didn't recognise or couldn't solve. Communication was the first problem. In the 16th century, there was no rapid communication across hundreds of miles. Philip II was in Spain, Medina Sidonia was commanding the fleet, Parma was in the Netherlands. Coordinating these three entities required letters carried by messengers, taking days or weeks to arrive. Real-time coordination was impossible. Philip's orders to Medina Sidonia were clear: sail to Calais and link with Parma. But Medina Sidonia couldn't communicate with Parma during the voyage to confirm timing or adjust plans. Parma didn't know exactly when the Armada would arrive. He had to guess when to start preparing his forces for embarkation. This lack of communication meant coordination had to be perfect. Everything happening exactly as planned, exactly on schedule. There was no flexibility for adjusting to circumstances. The Dutch blockade was the second problem. Dutch rebel forces, particularly the sea beggars, Dutch privateers and naval forces, controlled much of the coast and waters around Dutch ports. Parma's army was assembled in Flanders, roughly modern Belgium, in ports like Dunkirk and Newport. But these ports were blockaded by Dutch ships. Dutch shallow draft vessels, flyboats and other small craft could operate in the shallow coastal waters where Spanish heavy ships couldn't go. They could blockade ports effectively. Parma's troop transport barges were large, slow and defenseless. They needed protection from warships. But Spanish warships couldn't enter the shallow waters where the barges would embark. The Dutch blockade meant Parma couldn't embark his army until the Armada arrived to drive off the Dutch ships. But the Armada couldn't enter the shallow coastal waters to fight the Dutch blockade. This was a catch-22 that planners hadn't adequately considered. The plan assumed Parma could embark his troops and be ready when the Armada arrived. But the reality was that embarkation was impossible until the Armada dealt with the Dutch blockade, which the Armada couldn't do. When Medina Sidonia anchored at Calais on August 6 and sent urgent messages to Parma to bring the army, Parma had to respond that he needed more time. His barges weren't assembled, his troops weren't embarked. The Dutch were blockading his ports. He needed the Armada to drive off the Dutch before he could proceed. But Medina Sidonia couldn't leave Calais to attack the Dutch because he'd been ordered to wait for Parma. And attacking the Dutch blockade would require entering shallow waters where his heavy ships were vulnerable. Meanwhile, the English fleet was gathering. Every day Medina Sidonia waited at Calais, more English ships arrived. English commanders prepared the fireship attack. The coordination failure was complete. Parma had a powerful army, but couldn't embark it. Medina Sidonia had a powerful fleet, but couldn't link with Parma. English had time to prepare devastating attacks. After the fireship attack scattered the Armada and the Battle of Gravelines damaged it further, any chance of linking with Parma was gone. Medina Sidonia had to retreat, and Parma's army never got close to boarding ships. This coordination failure reveals important lessons about military planning and logistics. Complex plans requiring precise timing and coordination are extremely fragile. If one element fails, the entire plan can collapse. Communication limitations in pre-modern eras made coordination across distances extremely difficult. Planners who assumed perfect coordination were setting themselves up for failure. Geography matters enormously. The shallow Dutch coastal waters created tactical problems planners hadn't fully appreciated. The Dutch rebels' control of these waters was a critical vulnerability in Spanish plans. Political coordination was also problematic. Philip II in Spain, Medina Sidonia commanding the fleet, and Parma commanding the army, had somewhat different priorities and perspectives. Philip wanted the invasion to succeed for religious and political reasons. Medina Sidonia wanted to follow orders and preserve his fleet. Parma wanted to defeat the Dutch rebels and wasn't necessarily enthusiastic about the England adventure. These differing perspectives affected decision-making and probably contributed to coordination failures. The Dutch rebels' role in defeating the Armada is often underappreciated. The Dutch blockade was crucial in preventing Parma from embarking his army. If Parma had gotten his 30,000 veterans onto barges and crossed to England protected by the Armada, the invasion might have succeeded. English land forces were much smaller and less experienced than Parma's army. The Dutch rebels, by maintaining their blockade and preventing Spanish embarkation, contributed as much to defeating the Armada as English naval actions did. This shows how interconnected European conflicts were. The Dutch revolt directly affected Spanish-English war. English support for Dutch rebels was partly motivated by keeping Spain distracted in the Netherlands. Spanish attempt to conquer England was partly motivated by ending English support for Dutch rebels. Everything was connected. The Armada's failure had significant consequences for the Dutch revolt. Spain had hoped conquering England would break Dutch resistance. When the Armada failed, Dutch rebels were encouraged. The Dutch revolt continued for decades more, but after 1588, Dutch independence seemed increasingly likely. Spain couldn't concentrate enough force to crush the Dutch while also fighting England and other enemies. Eventually, Spain would recognize Dutch independence in 1648, 60 years after the Armada. But the trajectory toward Dutch victory was established partly by the Armada's defeat. Understanding Parma's role and the Dutch blockade helps us see the Armada campaign in fuller context, not just naval battles in the English Channel, but complex political and military maneuvering across multiple theatres of war. We've mentioned the storms that destroyed much of the Spanish Armada during its retreat around Scotland and Ireland. But let's understand in more detail what those storms were like and why they were so devastating. The North Atlantic in August and September is notorious for storms. The same weather patterns that create hurricanes in the Caribbean produce violent storms in the North Atlantic. Low-pressure systems form, drawing in winds from multiple directions. These systems can develop quickly and produce sustained winds of 50 to 70 miles per hour, with gusts even higher. Waves can reach 30 to 40 feet or more. For wooden sailing ships, these storms were existential threats. Ships were designed to survive normal sailing conditions, but extreme storms could overwhelm even well-built vessels. The Spanish ships retreating around Scotland faced a perfect storm, literally. Multiple weather systems converged in late August and September 1588, creating sustained bad weather across the region. The ships were already damaged from battle. Hulls had been breached by cannonballs. Rigging was damaged. Sails were torn. Masts were cracked or weakened. Ships that might have survived storms in good condition couldn't survive when already damaged. Water entering through battle holes couldn't be pumped out fast enough. Weakened masts snapped in high winds. The ships were also overcrowded, which affected stability and handling. 30,000 men had sailed with the Armada. Thousands had died in battle and from disease, but most were still alive, packed into ships designed for smaller crews. The weight distribution was all wrong. Ships rode lower in the water than designed, making them more vulnerable to being swamped by waves. The overcrowding also made ship handling difficult. Not enough room for crews to work sails and rigging effectively. Navigation in storms was nearly impossible. Pilots tried to keep ships away from rocky coasts, but in the storms, they often didn't know exactly where they were. Cloud cover meant no sun or stars for celestial navigation. Wind and currents pushed ships in directions they couldn't accurately measure. Ships ended up far from where pilots thought they were. This was particularly dangerous near Scotland and Ireland, where rocky coasts could tear ships apart. In clear weather, pilots could see land and avoid dangers. In storms, the first sign of land might be rocks appearing through spray just before the ship crashed into them. Many Spanish ships were wrecked on coasts they never saw until it was too late. The ships would be driven onto rocks, hulls would be breached, water would pour in, and the ships would break apart in the pounding waves. Sailors and soldiers trapped below decks had no chance. As water rushed in and ships broke up, men drowned in darkness, unable to escape. Those on deck might be washed overboard by waves, or they might cling to wreckage as ships disintegrated, eventually being thrown into the sea or crushed by debris. Some ships managed to beach themselves on sandy shores rather than hitting rocks. This gave crews better survival chances. They could wade or swim ashore and at least be alive, even if stranded far from home. But being shipwrecked on the coasts of Scotland or Ireland in 1588 meant facing new dangers on land. Scotland was somewhat sympathetic to Catholic causes. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been Scottish, and some Scottish nobles had Catholic leanings. Spanish sailors shipwrecked in Scotland had some chance of decent treatment, but Scotland was officially allied with England. Scottish authorities were supposed to arrest Spanish sailors and turn them over to English forces. The treatment Spanish received in Scotland varied by location and local authorities. Some were treated humanely, others were imprisoned or killed. Ireland was much worse for Spanish sailors. Ireland was under English control, and English authorities had issued clear orders. Spanish sailors coming ashore were to be killed. England saw the shipwrecked Spanish as dangerous enemies who might organize resistance or link up with Irish rebels who opposed English rule. Killing them eliminated this threat. English troops were stationed along Irish coasts specifically to deal with Spanish shipwreck survivors. When survivors came ashore, they were systematically hunted down. Some were killed immediately, shot, stabbed, or beaten to death on beaches as they struggled ashore. Others were rounded up and executed in groups, hanged, beheaded, or shot in mass killings. Local Irish people sometimes killed Spanish survivors too, partly from fear of English retaliation if they helped Spanish, partly to rob survivors of whatever possessions they had. Some Irish tried to help Spanish survivors, hiding them or providing food, but this was risky. English authorities offered rewards for captured Spanish sailors and punished anyone helping them. The scale of killing was horrifying. Thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers, survivors of battle and shipwreck, were murdered systematically on Irish beaches. Bodies washed up on shores for weeks after the storms. The remains of wrecked ships littered coastlines. Broken timber, torn sails, barrels, weapons, bodies. Modern archaeology has found Spanish Armada shipwrecks around Scotland and Ireland. These underwater sites contain artifacts, cannon, anchors, personal possessions that bring the human tragedy into focus. The storms affected not just the Spanish fleet, but also how the English remembered the victory. The devastation caused by weather was interpreted as divine intervention. English Protestants saw God's hand in the storms. God had sent weather to destroy the Catholic fleet, just as God had sent plagues against Egypt in the Bible. The storms were proof of divine favour toward Protestant England. This interpretation downplayed English naval skill and emphasised providence. It suggested England didn't just win through superior tactics, but through God's direct intervention. This providential interpretation had lasting cultural impact, shaping English self-understanding as a nation chosen by God and protected by divine power. For the Spanish, the storms were catastrophic, but not necessarily proof of divine disfavour. Spanish Catholics interpreted the disaster as divine testing or punishment for Spain's sins, requiring repentance and greater faithfulness. Both sides used religious frameworks to understand the natural disaster, but reached opposite theological conclusions. Modern understanding doesn't require choosing between these religious interpretations. The storms were meteorologically normal for North Atlantic in late summer. The devastation was caused by damaged ships in dangerous waters, not by supernatural intervention. But the human tragedy was real, regardless of interpretation. Thousands of men died horrible deaths, drowning in shipwrecks, murdered on beaches, dying of exposure and starvation, while stranded far from home. The maritime catastrophe of the Armada's retreat was as significant as the naval battles. More Spanish died in storms and their aftermath than died in combat. Understanding this dimension of the Armada story reminds us that warfare involves not just battles, but also suffering from disease, weather, shipwreck, and violence against helpless victims. When news of the Armada's catastrophic defeat reached King Philip II of Spain in the fall of 1588, how did he respond? Understanding Philip's reaction reveals much about his character and about Spanish political culture. Philip II was one of history's most powerful monarchs. He ruled Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, large parts of Italy, territories in Africa and Asia, and the vast Spanish-American Empire. He was the most powerful Catholic ruler and saw himself as God's agent on earth. Philip was also intensely bureaucratic and meticulous. He personally reviewed enormous numbers of documents, making decisions on matters large and small throughout his empire. He worked long hours in his study at the Escorial Palace, reading reports and writing marginal notes. When reports began arriving about the Armada's troubles, first the battles in the Channel, then the devastating losses during the retreat, Philip received them in his characteristic manner, calmly, quietly, accepting the news as God's will. According to contemporary accounts, Philip's response to the disaster was remarkably composed. He didn't rage or blame subordinates. He didn't deny the scale of the catastrophe. He accepted that the enterprise had failed and that enormous losses had occurred. Philip wrote to Medina Sidonia that the disaster was not the Duke's fault, but God's will. This wasn't just political courtesy. Philip genuinely believed that God controlled outcomes, and that Spain had failed because God had judged Spain unworthy, not because of human errors. This theological interpretation served important purposes. It protected Philip from having to admit strategic mistakes. If God caused the defeat, then human planning wasn't to blame. It also maintained Spanish morale. If the defeat was God's judgment, requiring Spain to be more faithful, then Spain could still win in the future once it had proven worthiness through greater devotion and repentance. Philip ordered religious services throughout Spain, prayers, masses, processions, asking God's forgiveness and seeking divine favour for future endeavours. But Philip was also practical. While accepting the disaster as God's will, he immediately began planning to rebuild the fleet and potentially try again. Within weeks of receiving news of the defeat, Philip was ordering new ships built, new crews recruited, New supplies accumulated. The Armada had failed, but Spain's strategic situation hadn't changed. England was still Protestant, still supporting Dutch rebels, still attacking Spanish interests. Philip spent the next decade trying to recover from the Armada disaster. The 1590s saw Spain building new fleets, launching new expeditions against England, and continuing warfare throughout Europe. But these subsequent efforts were less ambitious and less successful than the 1588 Armada. Spain never again attempted an invasion of England on the scale of 1588. Financial constraints were one reason. The Armada had cost an enormous amount, and Spain couldn't immediately finance another enterprise of similar scale. But psychological factors also mattered. The invincible reputation of Spanish military had been shattered. Commanders and sailors were less confident. Potential allies were less impressed by Spanish power. Philip's health also declined through the 1590s. He suffered from gout, fevers, and various ailments. By the mid-1590s, he was often too sick to work effectively. His energy and ability to manage the empire declined. When Philip died in 1598, he was 71 years old and had ruled Spain for over 40 years. He left an empire that was still vast and powerful, but also overstretched, financially strained, and facing multiple challenges. The war with England continued after Philip's death, finally ending with peace in 1604. But Spain never achieved the objective Philip had sought in 1588, conquering England and crushing English Protestantism. Philip's response to the Armada's defeat reveals the tension between religious interpretation and practical reality in early modern monarchy. Philip genuinely believed God controlled outcomes. His Catholic faith was sincere and profound. He interpreted the Armada's defeat through this religious framework, but he also understood political and military reality. Spain had enemies, strategic objectives, resources to deploy. Philip continued pursuing Spanish interests even after the disaster. This combination of religious faith and political pragmatism was characteristic of Philip and of Spanish policy generally in this era. Philip's subordinates responded to the defeat with more variation. Medina Sidonia was devastated. He'd commanded the greatest fleet in history and watched it destroyed. He expected to be punished or disgraced. Philip's acceptance of the disaster and refusal to blame Medina Sidonia was generous. It protected the Duke from consequences he probably deserved for some of the tactical decisions during the campaign. But Philip's generosity also served purposes. Blaming Medina Sidonia would implicitly admit the plan had flaws, or that Philip had chosen the wrong commander. Better to blame God's inscrutable will than to admit mistakes. Other Spanish commanders who'd survived the campaign had varied responses. Some blamed the disaster on bad luck, weather, English tactics, or coordination failures. Others, like Philip, interpreted it theologically as divine judgment. The common Spanish soldiers and sailors who survived were traumatized. Many never recovered from the physical and psychological wounds of the campaign. The Spanish public response was complex. Initially, there was shock and grief. The scale of losses, tens of thousands of men dead, affected families throughout Spain. But official narratives emphasized Spanish bravery, English treachery, and divine judgment. The defeat was presented not as Spanish failure, but as unfortunate circumstances beyond human control. This narrative protected Spanish pride and Philip's reputation, but it also prevented Spain from fully learning lessons from the disaster. If the defeat was God's will rather than the result of Spanish planning flaws, then Spain didn't need to change strategies or tactics. In contrast, England learned tactical and strategic lessons from the campaign that influence future naval warfare. Spain, interpreting the defeat theologically, was less likely to adapt. Philip's response to the Armada disaster was thus characteristic of his reign: devout, bureaucratic, determined, but also somewhat inflexible and reluctant to admit mistakes. This inflexibility contributed to Spain's gradual decline over the following decades. Spain continued pursuing the same strategies, defending Catholicism, maintaining the empire, fighting multiple wars that were gradually exhausting Spanish resources. Philip II died believing he'd served God faithfully, even though he hadn't achieved all his objectives. His funeral was magnificent, and he was mourned throughout the Catholic world as a defender of the faith. But history would judge his reign more critically. The Armada's defeat under his reign marked the beginning of Spanish decline and the rise of Spain's enemies. Understanding Philip's response to the Armada helps us see how religious interpretation, political reality, and personal character interact in shaping historical events and their consequences. The Spanish Armada has been remembered and commemorated very differently in England and Spain, creating contrasting cultural memories that tell us as much about national identities as about historical events. In England, the defeat of the Armada became one of the founding myths of English national identity, perhaps the founding myth for English sense of exceptionalism and naval greatness. The Armada story was told and retold through generations. It appeared in histories, commemorative art, popular songs, sermons, and political speeches. The story was simplified and dramatized, emphasizing English heroism and divine providence. The popular English narrative went something like this. Mighty Catholic Spain, the world's superpower, sent an invincible fleet to crush little Protestant England. English sailors, outnumbered but brave and clever, defeated the Armada through superior tactics and divine favor. God sent the Protestant wind to scatter the Spanish fleet. England was saved, Protestantism survived, and England's destiny as a great naval power was established. This narrative is partially true, but also simplified and mythologized. The English fleet wasn't as outnumbered as the narrative suggests. The fighting ships were more evenly matched than invincible Armada versus brave little England implies. English victory came from tactical superiority, better technology, home field advantage, and Spanish planning failures as much as from divine intervention or simple courage. But myths don't require complete accuracy. They serve cultural purposes, creating shared identity, teaching values, inspiring pride. The Armada myth taught English people that they were special, that God favoured England, that English sailors were the world's best, that English could defeat any enemy, despite being smaller or outnumbered. This mythology supported English imperialism in later centuries. When Britain built the world's largest empire, the Armada story was invoked to show that Britain was destined for greatness, that British naval power was providential, that British dominance was part of God's plan. The Armada story was taught in schools, commemorated in public monuments, referenced in political debates. It became inseparable from English identity. Queen Elizabeth I became associated with the Armada victory, even though she wasn't directly involved in the naval tactics. Her image as the monarch who'd stood firm against Spanish threat became iconic. The famous Armada portrait of Elizabeth, painted after the victory, shows her with her hand on a globe, with scenes of the battle in the background. The imagery declares, Elizabeth, defender of England, under whom English power extends globally. Francis Drake became a folk hero. The story of Drake finishing his game of bowls when the Armada was sighted, supposedly saying there was time to finish the game and beat the Spanish too, became legendary. This story probably isn't true, but it captured the image of English coolness under pressure, confidence in the face of overwhelming odds. The Armada myth was so powerful that it influenced how later English, British naval victories were understood. Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805 was explicitly compared to the Armada, Britain defeating another Spanish fleet, proving British naval supremacy. In Spain, the memory was very different. The Armada defeat was a painful national disaster, not something to commemorate proudly. Spanish accounts emphasize the bravery of Spanish sailors and soldiers, the overwhelming difficulties they faced, and the bad luck and weather that caused defeat. The narrative was, Spanish fought bravely against superior numbers. Incorrect, but the belief persisted. Were betrayed by storms and circumstances and suffered terrible losses. It was tragic, but not shameful. This narrative protected Spanish pride while acknowledging the disaster. Spanish sailors had been courageous. The defeat resulted from uncontrollable factors, not from Spanish weakness or incompetence. But the defeat was still embarrassing for a nation that had prided itself on military invincibility. Spanish culture didn't dwell on the Armada the way English culture did. The disaster was remembered, but not central to Spanish national identity in the way victory was central to English identity. Spain had other moments of glory to emphasize: the Reconquista, the conquest of the Americas, the defense of Catholicism. Philip II was remembered more for his long reign, his defense of Catholicism, and his construction of the Escorial Palace than for the Armada defeat. Spanish culture moved past the disaster. Interestingly, Spanish and English memories of the Armada have converged somewhat in modern times. Contemporary Spanish historians acknowledge the planning failures and tactical mistakes that contributed to defeat. Contemporary English historians recognize that English victory came from multiple factors beyond simple heroism or divine intervention. Tactical superiority, technological advantages, Spanish coordination failures. Modern commemoration of the Armada in both countries tends to emphasize the human drama, the scale of the fleets, the intensity of battle, the suffering during the retreat, the impact on both nations. Museums in both England and Spain have Armada exhibits. Archaeological sites where Armada ships wrecked are protected and studied. The story is told with more nuance and less nationalism than in past centuries. But cultural memory is persistent. The Armada story still resonates differently in England and Spain, shaped by centuries of different national narratives. For England, Britain, the Armada remains a proud moment, the defeat of a great threat, the beginning of naval supremacy, proof of national character. For Spain, it remains a painful memory, a great disaster, a moment when Spanish power was checked, a tragedy that cost thousands of lives. These different memories show how history is not just about what happened, but about how events are remembered, interpreted, and incorporated into national identities. The same event, the 1588 Armada campaign, means very different things to English and Spanish people because it plays different roles in their national stories. Understanding cultural memory helps us think critically about how our own societies remember history. What stories do we tell? Which events do we emphasize? How do we interpret the past to create our sense of who we are? The Armada story teaches us that history and memory are different things. History is what happened. Memory is what we make of what happened. The stories we tell, the meanings we find, the identities we build from past events. Both history and memory matter. History helps us understand what actually occurred. Memory shows us how past events continue to shape present identities and cultures. The Spanish Armada of 1588 happened, but the Armada of English national mythology and the Armada of Spanish cultural memory are different things, constructed from the historical event, but serving the purposes of nations trying to understand themselves. The Armada campaign taught lessons that influenced naval warfare for centuries. Let's explore what military historians and naval strategists learned from 1588 and how these lessons shaped later conflicts. Lesson 1. The importance of artillery and gunnery. The Armada campaign demonstrated that naval combat was shifting from boarding actions to artillery duels. Traditional naval warfare had been essentially land warfare on water. ships as platforms for soldiers to board enemy vessels and fight hand to hand. Victory went to the side with more soldiers and better infantry tactics. But the Armada showed that ships with superior artillery could defeat larger forces without boarding. English ships, using longer-range guns, fired more rapidly, inflicted devastating damage while staying out of boarding range. This lesson influenced naval design for centuries. Future warships emphasized artillery, more guns, heavier guns, better gun placement. Ships were designed as gun platforms rather than as troop transports. Naval gunnery became a specialized skill. Navies invested in training gun crews, developing techniques for rapid firing, accurate aiming, and effective ammunition use. The age of the ship of the line, warships designed to fight in line formation, firing broadsides, developed from lessons learned in 1588. These ships dominated naval warfare through the 18th and early 19th centuries. Lesson 2. Speed and maneuverability matter as much as size. The Spanish Armada was larger, with more ships and more soldiers. But English ships were faster and more maneuverable. This speed advantage allowed English to choose when and where to fight. They could attack advantageously positioned Spanish ships, then retreat before Spanish could respond. They controlled the tempo of battle. Future naval design emphasized speed and handling alongside firepower. Ships needed to be fast enough to exploit tactical opportunities and to escape when outmatched. This influenced the development of frigates, faster, more maneuverable warships that could scout, pursue, or escape as needed. These ships became crucial components of naval forces. Lesson 3. Home waters provide enormous advantages. England fought in waters it knew intimately. English sailors understood channel tides, currents, weather patterns, and coastal features. Spanish were operating far from home in unfamiliar waters. This put them at consistent disadvantage. They didn't know where shoals were, didn't anticipate weather changes, couldn't predict tidal effects. This lesson emphasized the importance of naval bases, of maintaining presence in key waters, of developing local knowledge wherever your fleet operates. The Royal Navy's later strategy of establishing naval bases worldwide, Gibraltar, Malta, Singapore, and dozens of others, came partly from understanding that local presence and knowledge provide tactical advantages. Lesson 4. Logistics determine outcomes as much as tactics. The Armada failed partly because of logistical failures: food supplies spoiling, ammunition running low, inability to resupply during the campaign. English had shorter supply lines, fighting in home waters. They could resupply relatively easily. Spanish, far from bases, couldn't replenish stocks of ammunition, food, or water. This lesson emphasized naval logistics as crucial to success. Navies needed systems for supplying fleets at sea, for maintaining ships far from home ports, for ensuring crews had adequate food and water. The development of naval logistics, supply ships, floating dry docks, overseas naval bases, preserved food technologies, came from recognition that fighting capability depends on supply. Lesson 5. Coordination across distances is extremely difficult. The Armada plan required coordination between Philip II in Spain, Medina Sidonia commanding the fleet, and Parma commanding the army in the Netherlands. This coordination failed completely. Communication was too slow, circumstances were unpredictable, and plans couldn't be adjusted in real time. The lesson: military plans requiring precise coordination across large distances and between separate commands are fragile. Plans need flexibility, and commanders need authority to adapt. This influenced military doctrine toward giving field commanders more discretion, toward building redundancy into plans, toward expecting that perfect coordination won't happen. Lesson 6. Weather and environment are uncontrollable factors. The storms that devastated the Spanish retreat were natural phenomena, not something either side controlled. But Spanish ships, damaged and overcrowded, couldn't survive storms that they might have weathered in good condition. English ships, in better shape and closer to safe harbours, handled the same weather more effectively. The lesson: you can't control weather, but you can design ships and plan operations to minimise weather vulnerability. Ships need to be seaworthy enough to survive storms. Operations need backup plans for bad weather. This influenced ship design towards stronger construction, better sealing, more redundant equipment. It also influenced operational planning to include weather contingencies. Lesson 7. Tactical flexibility beats rigid plans. Spanish tactics were rigid: maintain formation, sail to destination, execute plan as ordered. When circumstances changed, Spanish had difficulty adapting. English tactics were more flexible. Drake and other commanders could improvise, adapt to opportunities, and coordinate loosely without requiring orders for every action. This flexibility allowed English to exploit Spanish vulnerabilities as they appeared, attacking stragglers, using fire ships when the opportunity arose, pressing attack at gravelins when Spanish formation broke. The lesson: rigid command structures and inflexible plans are vulnerable to unexpected circumstances. Forces need ability to adapt quickly to changing situations. This influenced military doctrine toward mission-based orders. Tell commanders the objective, let them determine methods, rather than detailed prescriptive orders. Tell commanders exactly what to do. Lesson 8. Technology advantage is force multiplier. English didn't have overwhelmingly superior technology, but they had specific advantages: better guns, faster ships, more effective tactics for using their advantages. These relatively modest technological edges, exploited effectively, allowed English to defeat a much larger force. The lesson: invest in technological advantages and in tactics that exploit them. Small technological edges can have large strategic effects if used effectively. This influenced naval development toward constant innovation, seeking any technological edge that might provide tactical advantage. The arms race in naval technology that accelerated in the 19th century came partly from this understanding. Lesson 9. Morale and confidence matter. Spanish sailors and soldiers were demoralized by constant English attacks, by coordination failures, by being far from home in hostile waters. English were fighting for survival in home waters, confident in their tactics, encouraged by early successes. This morale advantage affected performance. The lesson: maintaining morale is as important as maintaining equipment. Forces need to believe they can win, need to understand their purpose, need to feel supported. This influenced military leadership toward attending to morale, through communication, through ensuring adequate supplies and rest, through celebrating successes. Lesson 10. Decisive victory requires exploitation. English defeated the Armada tactically, but didn't destroy it completely. English ran low on ammunition and couldn't pursue. Spanish fleet, though defeated and damaged, was not eliminated. Ships and crews survived to return to Spain. Spain remained capable of rebuilding and trying again. The lesson: tactical victory needs to be exploited strategically to achieve decisive outcomes. Defeating an enemy force isn't enough. You need to ensure the enemy can't recover. This influenced military strategy toward pursuing defeated enemies, toward ensuring victories are decisive rather than temporary. These lessons shaped naval warfare for the next 3 centuries. The principles established or demonstrated in 1588, the importance of gunnery, the value of speed and flexibility, the necessity of logistics, remained relevant through the age of sail and into the era of steam-powered warships. Naval strategists studied the Armada campaign as a teaching case. The battles were analysed in naval academies. The strategic decisions were debated by military theorists. The Royal Navy's dominance from the 17th through 19th centuries was built partly on lessons learned in 1588. British naval doctrine, ship design, and tactical approaches all reflected Armada lessons. Understanding what the Armada taught about naval warfare helps us appreciate its historical significance beyond the immediate political consequences. The campaign influenced how nations thought about sea power for centuries. The defeat of the Spanish Armada had profound consequences for American history. While the Armada never came near America, its failure in 1588 created conditions that enabled successful English colonization 2 decades later. Before the Armada, English colonization of America was tentative and mostly unsuccessful. Roanoke failed twice. English explorers visited American coasts, but didn't establish permanent presence. Spain, as the dominant colonial power, could credibly threaten any English colonial ventures. Spain claimed vast American territories and had demonstrated willingness to eliminate rival colonies, as they'd done to the French at Fort Caroline in 1565. English investors and colonizers had to consider Spanish threat. Would Spain attack English colonies? Would Spain's powerful navy intercept English ships? Would Spanish retaliation make colonization too risky? These concerns limited English colonization before 1588. Investors were cautious, ventures were small scale. The risk seemed high relative to potential returns. The Armada's defeat changed this calculation fundamentally. Spain had tried to conquer England with the greatest naval force ever assembled, and had failed catastrophically. If Spain couldn't conquer England, Spain probably couldn't eliminate English colonies in territories Spain claimed. Spain's power had limits. Spanish threats weren't as intimidating as before. This psychological shift was crucial for English colonization. After 1588, English investors and colonizers were more confident. Spain was still dangerous, but not invincible. The risk of Spanish retaliation, while real, was acceptable. The war between England and Spain continued until 1604, but England held its own. English privateers raided Spanish colonies successfully. English naval forces defended English waters. England wasn't dominated by Spain. When peace came in 1604, England was in stronger position than before 1588. The 16-year war had proven England could compete with Spain militarily and economically. This confidence enabled the Virginia Company to be chartered in 1606. The Virginia Company was a joint stock company, investors pooling money to fund colonization, expecting profit returns if successful. The investors risked substantial money. The expedition to establish Jamestown in 1607 required ships, supplies, recruiting colonists, and sustaining the colony through early years. This required confidence that the investment could succeed. Would these investors have risked their money if the Armada had succeeded? Almost certainly not. Spanish conquest of England would have made English colonization impossible. Would investors have been as confident if England had lost the war with Spain? Probably not. They'd have worried about Spanish attacks on English colonies. But England had survived the Armada and the subsequent war. English investors felt confident enough to risk money on American colonization. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was the first permanent English settlement in America. It nearly failed multiple times. The starving time of 1609-1610 almost destroyed the colony. But Jamestown survived, partly because the Virginia Company maintained supply lines, partly because tobacco cultivation provided economic viability, partly because enough colonists came to sustain the settlement. Plymouth followed in 1620, another successful English colony in America. Massachusetts Bay in 1630, Maryland in 1634, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and others through the 1630s, 1640s. By the mid-17th century, English colonization of North America was well established. Tens of thousands of English colonists lived in American colonies. English presence was permanent and growing. This colonization was enabled by Spain's 1588 defeat. Not directly. The Armada didn't fight in America. Spanish forces didn't attack English colonies. But indirectly, by demonstrating Spanish power had limits, and by giving England confidence to challenge Spanish territorial claims. There's an alternative history we can imagine. If the Armada had succeeded, if Spain had conquered England, overthrown Elizabeth, and eliminated English Protestantism, there would be no English colonization of America. Spain would control the Atlantic. Spanish territories in America would be secure from English challenges. The entire east coast of North America might be Spanish or divided among Catholic powers: Spain, France, Portugal. The United States as we know it wouldn't exist. North America's political development would be entirely different. The language, culture, laws and institutions that shaped America came from English colonization, enabled by Spain's 1588 defeat. Even specific elements of American culture trace back to the Armada indirectly. English Puritans, who founded Massachusetts, were part of Protestant tradition that survived partly because Protestant England survived Spanish invasion attempt. English legal traditions that shaped American law, common law, representative government, individual rights, came from England and were preserved because England remained independent. The English language became dominant in North America because English colonies succeeded. If Spanish or French had colonized instead, North America might speak Spanish or French today. The Armada's defeat didn't determine these outcomes directly, but it created conditions where English colonization could proceed and eventually succeed. There's also irony in the connections. The Armada destroyed the Roanoke colony indirectly by preventing John White from returning with supplies. But the Armada's defeat cleared the way for Jamestown and later colonies. Roanoke failed partly because of the Armada, but later English colonies succeeded partly because the Armada failed. The consequences extended beyond just enabling colonization. The Armada's defeat also affected how English colonizers thought about their mission in America. English colonizers saw themselves as extending Protestant civilization and English liberty to new lands. They believed God had saved England from Spanish conquest for a purpose, perhaps to spread true religion to the New World. This sense of divine mission, rooted in the providential interpretation of the Armada's defeat, shaped English colonial ideology. Colonizers believed they were doing God's work, expanding God's kingdom, fulfilling England's destiny. This ideology had troubling consequences. It justified violence against indigenous peoples. It enabled exploitation and enslavement. It created self-righteous attitudes that caused enormous harm. But understanding this ideology's roots in the Armada story helps us see how European conflicts shaped American colonization, not just politically, but culturally and ideologically. The Spanish Armada of 1588 never came near American shores, but it shaped American history profoundly by determining which European powers could successfully colonize North America, by creating confidence that enabled English colonization, and by establishing England as a naval power capable of protecting overseas colonies. Understanding this connection helps us see American history in global context, not as isolated story of colonists in wilderness, but as part of broader patterns of European expansion, imperial rivalry, and global transformation. The United States exists partly because of decisions made in European courts, battles fought in European waters, and storms that battered ships off Scottish and Irish coasts in 1588. History is interconnected. Events in one place ripple through time and space to affect people far away who never witnessed the original events, but whose lives were shaped by them. The Spanish Armada is part of American history, even though it never reached America, because its consequences, Spanish decline, English rise, enable colonization, fundamentally shaped how North America was colonized and eventually how the United States was created. Let's engage in careful counterfactual thinking. What if the Spanish Armada had succeeded? What if Parma's army had crossed to England, Spanish forces had defeated English defences, and Philip II had conquered England? This is speculation, but we can make reasonable inferences based on what we know about Spanish goals, European politics, and colonial patterns. Immediate consequences of Spanish victory. Elizabeth I would have been captured or killed. Spanish forces wouldn't have let her remain in power. She'd be imprisoned, executed, or forced into exile. England would return to Catholicism. This was Philip's primary goal. Catholic Mass would be restored, Protestant practices suppressed, Anglican Church dismantled. A new English monarch would be installed, probably a Catholic noble acceptable to Philip, or possibly Philip himself, claiming the English throne through his marriage to Mary I. English Protestants would face persecution. Those who refused to convert would be imprisoned, executed, or forced to flee. The Spanish Inquisition might extend to England. Protestant resistance would probably occur. English people wouldn't all submit peacefully to Spanish Catholic rule. Rebellions, assassination attempts, and resistance movements would likely develop. European consequences. The Dutch revolt would probably collapse. Dutch rebels depended on English support. With England conquered, the Dutch would face Spain alone. Spain might crush the Dutch revolt completely, maintaining control of the Netherlands. Or the Dutch might fight on desperately, but without English help, their chances of success would be much lower. France's religious wars would be affected. French Protestants, Huguenots, depended partly on English support. With England gone, French Protestants would be weaker relative to French Catholics. This might mean earlier Catholic victory in France's religious wars, or more complete Catholic dominance of French politics. German Protestants would be more vulnerable. The Holy Roman Empire was divided between Protestant and Catholic states. English defeat would encourage Catholic forces and discourage Protestants. European Protestantism generally would be in crisis. The defeat of Protestant England by Catholic Spain would seem like divine judgment against Protestant heresy, demoralizing Protestants and energizing Catholics. Long-term European consequences. Spain would be enormously strengthened. Conquering England would give Spain control of English wealth, English naval forces, and English strategic position. Spain might become effectively unbeatable in Europe for decades. The combination of Spanish power, English resources, and control of the Netherlands would make Spain overwhelmingly dominant. This might prevent the balance of power system that developed in 17th century Europe. Instead of multiple competing powers, Spain might establish hegemony. Alternatively, other powers, France, German states, even the Ottoman Empire, might form desperate coalitions to counter Spanish dominance, leading to even more devastating wars. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, might not happen, or might happen very differently. This war devastated Central Europe and killed millions. Spanish conquest of England would have changed the religious and political landscape that produced the war. Consequences for North American colonization. English colonization of North America wouldn't happen. No Jamestown, no Plymouth, no Massachusetts, no English colonies along the Atlantic coast. Spanish colonization might expand. With Spain controlling England's resources and naval forces, Spain might colonize more extensively in North America. The Atlantic coast from Florida to Canada might become Spanish territory. Spanish missions, Spanish settlers, Spanish governance, all established throughout eastern North America. Alternatively, France might colonize more extensively without English competition. French colonies from Canada southward might dominate much of the continent. Or colonization might proceed more slowly without English, Spanish, French competition driving expansion. Cultural consequences for North America. North America might speak Spanish instead of English. Spanish culture, Spanish law, Spanish Catholic religion might dominate. Or, if French colonized extensively, French language and culture might dominate. The United States as we know it wouldn't exist. The particular combination of English legal traditions, Protestant religious culture, and Enlightenment political philosophy that shaped America came from English colonization. Different colonizing powers would create different political structures, different cultural traditions, different historical trajectories. Indigenous peoples would face colonization regardless, Spanish, French, or English. But the specific patterns of colonization, the diseases spread, the violence employed, would differ based on which power colonized. Economic consequences. Spain's conquest of England would give Spain control of English commerce, English manufacturing, English financial systems. This might strengthen Spain's economy by adding English production capacity. Or it might overstretch Spain's administrative capabilities, making the empire harder to govern effectively. The integration of English and Spanish economies might create a super economy dominating global trade. Or it might create inefficiencies as Spanish colonial economic policies applied to England. Silver from American mines would flow to a larger empire, funding even more military operations and potentially changing global economic patterns. Possible Spanish decline anyway. Interestingly, even if Spain conquered England, Spain might still eventually decline. The structural problems that caused Spain's historical decline, overextension, military costs, economic policies, might affect Spain regardless. Conquering England would give Spain more resources, but also more territories to defend, more rebellions to suppress, more costs to bear. Spain might peak even higher, but decline even faster, collapsing from overextension and exhaustion after achieving maximum expansion. The fragility of Spanish victory. For Spain to actually succeed, many things had to go right. The Armada had to survive storms and English attacks. Parma's army had to embark despite Dutch blockade. The crossing had to succeed despite English naval opposition. Spanish forces had to defeat English armies on land. Spanish occupation had to suppress English resistance. Spanish governance had to maintain control long-term. Each of these steps was difficult, and many could fail. Even if the Armada had fought more successfully in 1588, Spanish victory wasn't assured. Why this matters? Counterfactual thinking helps us see that history wasn't inevitable. The Armada could have succeeded. Small changes, different weather, different tactical decisions, different luck, might have changed outcomes. Understanding what might have happened if Spain won helps us appreciate what did happen when Spain lost. The defeat of the Armada shaped world history profoundly. It also reminds us that the world we live in resulted from contingent events, things that could have gone differently. The United States exists partly because storms hit the Spanish fleet in August-September 1588. This doesn't mean history is random. Structural factors, economic systems, technological development, political organization constrain what's possible. But within those constraints, specific events and decisions matter. The Spanish Armada campaign was one of those hinge moments when outcomes could have gone differently, and the world would have developed along different paths. We live in the world created by Spain's defeat. Understanding what might have been helps us appreciate what is. The Spanish Armada story has been told and retold for over 400 years. But some of what everyone knows about the Armada is myth rather than history. Let's separate fact from fiction. Myth 1. The Invincible Armada. Popular narrative. Spain called its fleet the Invincible Armada, arrogantly assuming it couldn't be defeated. Reality: the Spanish didn't call it invincible, they called it La Felicísima Armada, the most fortunate fleet, or La Grande y Felicísima Armada, the great and most fortunate fleet. Invincible Armada was an English term, used partly mockingly after the defeat. Calling it invincible after it lost emphasized Spanish arrogance and divine judgment against it. Spanish weren't uniquely arrogant. They knew naval campaigns were risky. They hoped for success, but didn't assume it was guaranteed. Myth 2. England was overwhelmingly outnumbered. Popular narrative: tiny England faced enormous Spanish fleet with impossible odds. Reality: the Spanish fleet was larger, about 130 ships, versus English total of about 200 ships. But many ships on both sides were small vessels unsuited for major combat. The core fighting fleets were more evenly matched, perhaps 30 to 40 major English warships versus similar number of Spanish galleons. English weren't outnumbered as dramatically as legends suggest. The myth of overwhelming Spanish numbers made English victory seem more miraculous, emphasizing English courage and divine intervention. Myth 3. The Protestant wind was a single miraculous storm. Popular narrative: God sent one great storm that destroyed the Armada in a moment of divine intervention. Reality: there were multiple storms over several weeks. Weather in North Atlantic in August-September is often stormy. These weren't unusual weather patterns. The storms were significant and contributed to Spanish losses, but they were natural phenomena, not single miraculous events. English interpreted storms as divine intervention, but meteorologically they were normal seasonal weather. Unusually destructive because Spanish ships were damaged and poorly positioned. Myth 4. Drake finished his game of bowls before responding to the Armada. Popular narrative: when the Armada was sighted, Drake was playing bowls. He calmly finished his game, saying there was time to finish and beat the Spanish too. Reality: this story probably isn't true, or is exaggerated. It first appeared in accounts written decades after the event. If Drake did say something like this, it might have been about tides, waiting for favorable tides to sail rather than casual confidence. The story became popular because it embodied English coolness under pressure. True or not, it served cultural purposes. Myth 5. Spanish ships were medieval and obsolete. Popular narrative: Spanish sailed old-fashioned galleons while English had modern ships. Reality: Spanish ships were contemporary designs, not obsolete. Some Spanish vessels were newer than English ships. The differences were in design philosophy. Spanish built for boarding, English for gunnery, not in one side having modern ships and the other having medieval ones. Spanish ships were effective for their intended purposes. They just weren't designed for the tactical approach the battle required. Myth 6. The Armada was completely destroyed. Popular narrative: every Spanish ship was sunk, total annihilation of the fleet. Reality: about half the ships and half the men returned to Spain. Losses were catastrophic, but not total. About 60 to 70 ships were lost to battle, storm, and shipwreck. About 60 to 70 ships returned, many damaged. About 15,000 men died, but about 15,000 survived and returned home. The disaster was enormous, but not quite the complete annihilation legend sometimes suggests. Myth 7. England won through superior technology. Popular narrative: English ships and guns were far superior to Spanish equivalents. Reality: English had some technological advantages, better gun designs, faster ships but not overwhelming superiority. Victory came from combination of factors: tactical superiority, fighting in home waters, superior seamanship, better use of technology, Spanish coordination failures, and weather. Technology mattered, but tactics, strategy, and circumstances mattered more. Myth 8. Philip II gave up after the Armada failed. Popular narrative. The Armada defeat ended Spanish efforts to conquer England. Reality. Spain launched additional armadas in the 1590s. These were smaller and all failed, but Philip didn't give up after 1588. Spain and England remained at war until 1604. The conflict continued for 16 years after the Armada. Spanish defeat was significant, but not immediately decisive. Spain remained a great power for decades. Myth 9. The defeat ended Spanish naval power. Popular narrative. After the Armada, Spain was finished as a naval power. Reality. Spain rebuilt its fleet relatively quickly. By the 1590s, Spain had recovered much naval capability. Spanish treasure fleets continued operating throughout the 1590s and beyond. Spanish naval forces remained significant through the 17th century. Spanish power declined gradually over decades, not immediately after the Armada. Myth 10. The Armada story is simple. Good guys, England, versus bad guys, Spain. Popular narrative. Heroic Protestant England versus villainous Catholic Spain. Clear good versus evil. Reality. Both sides had legitimate perspectives. Both sides committed violence. Both sides believed they were fighting for righteous causes. Philip II genuinely believed he was defending Catholicism and eliminating heresy. Elizabeth I genuinely believed she was defending Protestantism and English independence. Spanish sailors and soldiers weren't villains. They were men following orders, trying to serve their country and God. English sailors weren't uniquely heroic. They were defending their homeland effectively. The religious conflict was real and deeply felt on both sides, but neither side had monopoly on virtue or evil. Why myths develop? Myths develop because they serve cultural purposes. They simplify complex events into memorable stories. They provide clear heroes and villains. They teach values and inspire pride. They make history emotionally engaging. They support national identities. Myths aren't necessarily lies. They're simplified, dramatized versions of events that emphasize certain aspects while downplaying others. The importance of historical accuracy. While myths serve purposes, historical accuracy matters because it helps us understand what actually happened and why. It reveals complexity that myths obscure. It shows multiple perspectives rather than single narrative. It teaches critical thinking about sources and claims. It prevents misuse of history for propaganda. Understanding both the myths and the realities of the Armada helps us appreciate the event's true significance, while recognizing how it's been remembered and used culturally. The Armada story is genuinely dramatic without mythologizing. The real events, massive fleets, desperate battles, storms, suffering, strategic consequences, are compelling enough without exaggeration. But the myths persist because they're powerful stories that shape how English and Spanish people think about their histories and identities. Distinguishing fact from myth doesn't diminish the Armada's importance. It enriches our understanding by showing both what happened and what people made of what happened. As we close our exploration of the Spanish Armada, let's reflect on why this 436-year-old event still matters and what it teaches us about history, power, and human affairs. The human story. At its core, the Armada is a human tragedy. Thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers, men with families, hopes, fears, died horrible deaths from battle, drowning, starvation, disease, and murder. Thousands of English sailors faced terror in combat, not knowing if they'd survive the next Spanish broadside. Families on both sides lost fathers, sons, brothers. John White couldn't return to his family at Roanoke because England needed every ship. His granddaughter, Virginia Dare, disappeared into history. These personal tragedies connect to the larger geopolitical conflict. The Armada wasn't just about nations and strategies. It was about human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control, making impossible choices, suffering consequences of decisions made by distant kings and commanders. The contingency of history. The Armada could have succeeded. If storms hadn't scattered the fleet, if Parma had managed to embark his army, if Spanish tactics had been different, outcomes might have been very different. History isn't inevitable. Small changes, different weather, different tactical decisions, different luck, can have enormous consequences. The world we live in resulted partly from storms off Scotland in 1588, from Drake's decision to use fireships at Calais, from Medina Sidonia's choice to retreat rather than continue fighting. Understanding this contingency helps us see that outcomes we take for granted weren't preordained. The United States exists partly because of events in 1588 that could easily have gone differently. The interconnection of events. The Armada connects to so many other historical threads. The Protestant Reformation, the Dutch Revolt, English colonization of America, the rise and fall of empires. Understanding the Armada requires understanding European religious conflicts, Spanish imperial strategy, English naval development, and the beginnings of American colonization. No historical event is isolated. Everything connects to other events in complex webs of causation. The Armada demonstrates this interconnection dramatically. The limits of power. Spain in 1588 was the greatest power on earth, wealthiest, most powerful military, largest empire. Yet Spain couldn't defeat Little England. Power has limits. Being powerful doesn't guarantee success. Superior resources don't ensure victory. Even the strongest empires face constraints on what they can accomplish. Spain learned this painfully. The Armada's defeat showed that Spanish power, while immense, wasn't unlimited. Spain couldn't simply overwhelm opponents through size alone. This lesson applies beyond 1588. Throughout history, powerful nations and empires discover that power alone doesn't guarantee success. Strategy, tactics, adaptability, and circumstances matter. The role of technology and innovation. English victory came partly from technological advantages, better guns, faster ships, but more from effective use of technology. Spanish had technology too, but they used it less effectively. English maximized their advantages through superior tactics and training. This shows that technology matters, but so does how you use it. Innovation in tactics and strategy can be as important as innovation in technology. This lesson applies to modern conflicts, where technological superiority doesn't guarantee victory if tactics and strategy are inadequate. The religious dimension. The Armada was fundamentally about religious conflict. Catholic Spain versus Protestant England. Holy war for souls and power. Both sides believed God was on their side. Both interpreted events through religious lenses. Both were willing to kill and die for religious beliefs. Understanding this religious intensity helps us see why the conflict was so bitter and why both sides fought so desperately. It also reminds us that religious conflicts can be extraordinarily destructive. When people believe God commands them to fight, compromise becomes difficult and violence intensifies. The creation of national identity. The Armada became central to English national identity, the moment when England proved it could stand against the greatest power on earth. This national myth shaped English culture for centuries, influencing imperialism, naval tradition, and national self-understanding. Understanding how nations create founding myths from historical events helps us think critically about our own national narratives. The impact on America. Though fought entirely in Europe, the Armada profoundly shaped American history by enabling English colonization that eventually created the United States. Language, laws, political traditions, cultural assumptions that shaped America came from English colonization made possible by Spain's defeat. This shows how European conflicts determined much of American development. American history isn't separate from European history, it's intertwined. The gradual shift in global power. The Armada marked the beginning of Spain's long decline and England's rise, a shift in global power that would reshape the world. This wasn't immediate. Spain remained powerful for decades, but the trajectory was set. Spain declining, England rising, eventually creating the British Empire that would dominate the 19th century. Understanding this long-term shift helps us see historical change as process rather than single events. The Armada was one moment in decades-long transformation, lessons about planning and execution. The Armada campaign teaches about the gap between plans and reality. Spanish plans were logical on paper, but failed in execution. Coordination failed, weather intervened, the enemy adapted, circumstances changed. The perfect plan collapsed when it encountered reality. This applies beyond military history. Complex plans requiring perfect coordination and ignoring unpredictable factors are fragile. The importance of adaptability. English won partly through adaptability, changing tactics as circumstances changed, exploiting opportunities as they appeared, improvising effectively. Spanish lost partly through rigidity, following plans even when circumstances made them obsolete, failing to adapt quickly enough. This teaches that adaptability and flexibility are crucial for success in unpredictable situations. The human cost of geopolitics. The Armada reminds us that geopolitical conflicts have human costs, not just for combatants, but for ordinary people caught in consequences. The Roanoke colonists paid the price for Spanish-English conflict they probably barely understood. Spanish sailors died in storms and were murdered on Irish beaches. English families lost loved ones in battle. When we study geopolitics and strategy, we shouldn't forget the human beings who suffer consequences of decisions made by distant leaders. Why we study history. The Armada story shows why history matters. It helps us understand how the present was created, how events ripple through time, how human choices shape outcomes. It teaches about human nature, courage and cowardice, intelligence and foolishness, adaptation and rigidity. It shows the complexity of historical causation, how multiple factors interact to produce outcomes, how small events can have large consequences. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Spanish Armada of 1588. From the religious hatreds and political rivalries that sparked the conflict, through the desperate battles in the English Channel, the devastating storms of the retreat, to the long-term consequences that shaped both Europe and America. We've explored not just what happened, but why it mattered. How the Armada's defeat shifted the balance of power, how it enabled English colonization of America, how it shaped national identities, and how it teaches lessons about power, planning, and human affairs. The Armada was more than just a naval battle. It was a turning point where historical trajectories shifted. Spain beginning its long decline, England beginning its rise, and America's future being determined by events thousands of miles away. Remember John White, who couldn't return to Roanoke because every English ship was needed to fight the Armada. Remember the thousands of Spanish sailors who died in storms and on Irish beaches. Remember that great events in history are made up of countless personal tragedies. Next time, we'll explore another chapter in American history. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the fascinating complexity of our past. Good night.